So you know what happened, then I started in the building meetings. Or there's meeting. Yeah, it's not the same. Yeah, I mean, well, we're
We're all set up. Okay, good afternoon. It's 1 o'clock. I'd like to call this special meeting of the Pasco Basin Cooperative Committee to order and invite you to stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Would you call roll, please, Mr. Blakesley?
Yes. Committee member Dodds.
Here.
Thank you. Committee member Hammond.
Here.
Committee member Scott.
Here.
Committee member Gibson.
Here.
Thank you. And Chair Turrentine.
Here.
There is a quorum.
Thank you. We have a new face here on the committee. I'd like to welcome Mr. Scott from EPC. He's the alternate for EPC, and invite him to just very briefly introduce himself.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you mentioned, my name is Ryan Scott here today representing the EPC. My wife, I, and our 2 kids live in Templeton, where we've been for a few years. Prior to that, we lived in Paso for about 10. We started sports in Templeton, so we've gotten the opportunity to engage with the community there. I've been fortunate enough to coach a few of my oldest son's teams, which has been both eye-opening but extremely fulfilling at the same time. And again, appreciate the opportunity today to represent the EPC.
Thank you. Mr. Blakesley, would you briefly review the meeting protocols?
Yes. Thank you, Chair. We'll just for folks in the audience, the way the meeting will happen tonight is there will be a presentation by staff, followed by public comments, and then we'll go to the committee for further discussion. On public comment, wanted to remind folks that there's we are going to implement a strict 3-minute per person time limit, so we'll be timing you. And again, just sort of ask that we will be enforcing that. We have a lot of folks tonight, and we just need to keep the meeting running efficiently. We'll just want to make sure that's understood. And then if you have a public comment, we'll take folks in the audience first and then move to folks online. And then we also ask those online to avoid discussions in the chat. Again, not everyone's privy to those messages. And remain muted on Zoom. And if you're in the room, we want to remind folks to silence their cell phones. Yeah.
And I'd just like to add 2 comments. One, the AC is a little loud. We're working to get that shut off. And also just wanted to point out for everybody, we have emergency exits here, those 2, and please. And then there's one other one right there. Just want to make sure that everyone's aware of where the egress points are. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ely.
I have a pre-meeting announcement. I couldn't hear very well back there. There's extra seats up here, and it's free to move out if you can't hear me.
Huh? So let's start with item 5, public comment for items not on today's agenda. Start with public comment from those in the room. Not seeing any public comment online, Mr. Blakesley, for items not on today's agenda. Oh, Mr. Graywall.
Thank you very much, Greg Graywall. Thank you, board. I don't know how many people know because I don't see a lot of faces here except for one that attends the San Miguel CSD meetings. And maybe Mr. Dodd will speak to it later, but it's not on the agenda. That's that they're not pursuing the $1 million grant for the half-mile pipe to nowhere with no contract to people and no treated water to put in the pipe. So that's 1 million of the. I think they were going to have to spend like 700,000 to 800,000 to even get the $1 million. So wasn't a very good deal that their board decided that wasn't a good enough deal for them to especially give up 200 acre feet of recharge water, so it could be used on a vineyard and blended with 80% of well water, mixed with 20% of blended water a couple months out of the year. Didn't really make any sense. And, just so it shows a lot of this money that's being spent, the $7.6 million really haven't got good projects that benefit the basin. It's kind of a special interest. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment? In person, Mr. Powell.
Greg Powell, Templeton resident. Also vice chair of TAG, now representing TAG today. So looking at today's agenda for this meeting, I noticed there are certain projects, PBCC related projects that are not on the agenda, but some of them are listed for tonight's town hall meeting. So I'm wondering why, for example, the Miller program, which is a controversial program that's been discussed a lot in the recent past, is not on today's agenda for an update, but it's presented as a topic for tonight's town hall meeting. I don't see any comments on an update of the expanded groundwater well monitoring network. And also a couple items that I've never even heard of for tonight's town hall meeting is ag pumping estimation project. Not sure what that is. And there's also a dry well reporting. That's all it said on this notice. But I have no idea what that means. If there's a program that hasn't been disclosed yet for dry well reporting, I'd like to hear about all of them today.
Thank you.
Joyce Sprague, Paso Robles. Just wondering why you've chosen to do this meeting 2 years after you received a grant and gotten together, and it's 9 days before Christmas.
Thank you. Any other public comment from participants in the room? Any online, Mr. Blakesley?
None online.
That will close public comment for items not on the agenda. Any discussion from committee members? With that, Mr. Blakesley, will you please introduce item 6?
Yes, thank you. Again, there was a grant that Paso Basin was awarded a $7.6 million grant from the California Department of Water Resources. It is for the implementation of its groundwater sustainability plan. The grant spending plan is composed of 6 components, and component 6 is the water supply feasibility and engineering studies, of which the State Water Project feasibility study is one of those projects in component 6. An RFP was issued for that project earlier this year, and Provo and Pritchard was the selected consultant. And an update on that study is going to be presented on the following slides by Terry online. He was hoping to be here tonight, but things came up and was unable to make it in person. So appreciate flexibility in allowing him to present online. And with that, Terry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Taylor, and everybody else. I unfortunately came down a little bit under the weather and wasn't able to travel down there. Probably, I think you might appreciate me not being down there in person. So what I was going to do is go over the State Water Project supplemental study and start with a little introduction, go talk about the state project supply and capacity available for moving water down there, get into state project costs, and then talk about where we're at on alternatives development. So next slide.
1 second, Terry.
Okay, next slide. Okay, so the State Water Project supply is available to Paso Robles Subbasin. As background, the county has a contract with the Department of Water Resources for 25,000 acre feet of State Water Project Table A amounts. the State Water Project Table A amounts are the amount that you can deliver up to, and in most years they're below that. And the Department of Water Resources does evaluations every 2 years of what the capability of the Department of Water Resources for delivering State Water Project is. And their most recent study showed that about 50% of that water could be delivered, and they ended up allocating about 56% of that water. Of the 25,000 acre feet of maximum Table A amounts that the county has, 10,500 is already committed to several subcontractors, Pismo Beach, Morro Bay, and a lot of other users on the Churro Valley Pipeline and Lopez project. That knocks down the amount potentially available just below 15,000 acre feet. And there's uses potentially for other users in the county. I set aside 1,500 acre feet. It might actually be higher than that. And so was looking at, for the purposes of this evaluation, using a placeholder of about 13,000 acre feet of water of Table A amounts that would be available for the Paso Robles subbasin. That would provide on average about 7,100 acre feet of allocation. Next slide. So this is pretty much the same information I just talked to you, but just more of a picture representation of it. So on the left figure, it shows the amounts that I've been talking about 25,000 acre feet total. I've got Paso Basin shown in orange, and so about 13,000 acre feet of Table A. And then on the right figure, it shows what that amounts to in wet water, about 7,100 acre feet. Next slide. And this is from the Department of Water Resources Delivery Capability Report. And this shows the amount of that supply that would be available year by year, with a repeat of the water supply that occurred over the last 100 years from 1922 through 2021. And the purpose of this is just to give you a feel for how this varies. And it can go from almost nothing in a few years, like 1977, to nearly the full amount of that Table A amounts, close to 13,000 in several years. And in some cases, it goes from very little to a lot in 1 year. So it is very subject to hydrology. And the other point to make, I guess, is that the advantage of this is that for areas that have a lot of storage, especially groundwater storage, this actually is not a bad way to take water. With areas that have a lot of storage, they have a lot of ability to absorb that water in wet years, and so this can build up their reserves for dry years. So this is just showing you how that varies. Next slide. So Article 21 water, there is, in addition to that Table A amounts, there's also intermittent water that's available called Article 21 under the State Water Project contracts. And that's available on a weekly basis when the Delta has high flows and San Luis Reservoir has been filled and the State Water Project doesn't have any ability to absorb any more water. Looking at the department's projections, if you look at San Luis Obispo County's share of Article 21 water, it amounts to about $300, 300 acre feet per year on average. So not a huge amount of additional water, but this would be over and above the Table A of water, and this is something that is just available when it's available, and it's not something that you're paying. For this water, you're just paying the pumping costs, the direct pumping costs, which are about $150 an acre foot. That 300 acre feet per year is based on the county's share of Article 21 water, but a lot of times when it's available, it's not allocated, and so it's possible that you could get higher amounts. And So the upside of it is that you could get some fairly big amounts in some of the real wet years. The downside is that some of the years of the that it's really wet, it's wet on the San Joaquin River, and you might be having you might have some water locally, or maybe not. It's just, it's kind of hit or miss. Next slide. And this shows the amount of that Article 21 water. It's about 1/4 of the number of years. And so it gets up to a few thousand acre feet in some of the real good years. And it averages about 300, but it's got even more variability than the table A amounts. Next slide. So up till now, I've been talking about how much water is available to the county. But now I want to move on to talking about what the ability to get that water to San Luis Obispo County is. And this is a figure showing some of the State Water Project canal or aqueduct reaches that would be involved in getting water to San Luis Obispo County. So reaches 1 through 8D are running from Tracy down to Kettleman City on the California Aqueduct. And there's generally a fair amount of capacity in those reaches. The county has a share of about 41 CFS of capacity. Aqueduct Reach 31A is the first reach of the phase 1 of the coastal branch, and there's capacity for San Luis Obispo County of about 47 CFS. Reach 33A is the first reach of the new of the phase 2 of coastal branch, which was constructed in the 90s. And there's 3 pumping plants that go up to Polonio Pass that would be covered in this. And then reach 33B is the stretch from Polonio Pass down to further down to Santa Maria and on down to Lake Cachuma. Next slide. And I neglected to point out in the previous slide, it's you don't need to go back there, but I neglected to point out that in Reach 31A and in Reach 33A and Reach 33B, the phase 2 of the coastal branch, the allocated share for the San Luis Obispo County drops considerably. So these figures are showing the capacity of the canal of the aqueduct reaches. And the one on the left shows Badger Hill Pumping Plant, which is representative of Reach 31A. And that's the phase 1 of Coastal Branch. And the dashed black line shows the canal of the aqueduct capacity there. It's just over 450 CFS. And then the lines show the historic use of that capacity since 2005. So about a 20-year period, most recent data. And the point here is that the actual use of that capacity has never been close to being what the capacity is. The highest delivery amounts in looks like it's 2007 are up close to 380, and there's about another 70 CFS of capacity that's not used even in those extreme circumstances. And in most years, it's considerably more. So there really isn't any constraint to how much water can be moved towards San Luis Obispo County and Reach 31A. And the figure on the right shows the Reach 33A, which is the section going to Polonio Pass Pumping Plant. And that's got the same, it also has a lot of capacity based on historical use. That reach was actually sized to a higher capacity to allow for energy use optimization, which really hasn't taken place. And it's used less than 50% of capacity almost all the time. So there's really no capacity limitations in that reach. So both reaches 31A and 33A, they check out that there's no you wouldn't expect them to have any kind of limitations on how much capacity is available, physical capacity. So this right here, I'm just talking about what's physically available, not talking about contractual capacity. And visualizing where you have physical capacity, Paso Basin could be taking water on a second tier basis, on an as available basis, wheeling water through these facilities in essence, and not having firm capacity, which is a different thing, and that's really not needed in this case. Next slide. So then this moves on to reach 33B, and in 33B, it's a little different story. The capacity of that reach is only about 70, a little bit over 70 CFS, about 71 CFS. This is showing that the historical use in that reach has been fairly significant in a lot of years. And it's within 10 CFS of capacity somewhat frequently in the summers in May through August. Sorry. In the rest of the year and a lot of the other years, then there is a lot of capacity, but there can be some limitations in reach 33B, and so that's something that we're conscious of and trying to identify how this project would work. The other thing to note is that the capacity limitations too tend to be more in the peak summer months or during the peak irrigation demand. So more to the extent that there are any problems with capacity, they're in the period from May through September. And that's just right about when you would hope to have water for delivery, for direct delivery. So that's something that affects the project development that we'll get into later on. Next slide. Okay, this is the same figure kind of turned around on its head. And this figure shows that the unused amount of the storage, it's computed and for the same period of years. So it's that previous figure kind of flipped. And then on the bottom, this shows two different potential levels of use for the Paso Basin. And so one of them is a 12 CFS target, 12 cubic feet per second, which is on the bottom. And then there's a 24 CFS target on the top. And the 12 CFS target corresponds to on the order of about 7,000 acre feet of water deliveries. And then the 24 CFS target is about 14,000 acre feet of deliveries. So that 14,000 acre feet, the 24 CFS is the amount that you would look at to deliver the full amount of the table A amounts to the county or to the Paso Basin. Next slide. And then this figure is a probability representation of how often those percentages would be limiting. So this summarizes that the data in the previous figure and shows a probability. So it shows 100% on the left and 0% on the right. And so you would have 100% chance. So looking at the 12 CFS target, you would have 100% chance of delivering just under 6,000 acre feet per year. And after that, about a 94% chance of delivering 6,800 or so. So, and then after that, essentially you're delivering the full 7,000 acre feet. So what this is saying to me is that you're really in you're relatively well off just living with existing capacity in reach 33B up to about that 12 CFS target. Looking at the 24 CFS target, you get more limitations on the amount that you can deliver, and that gets to be more problematic. So next slide. Okay, thank you. Now it's going to talk about state project costs. The state water project it was started off in the sixties. And the State Water Project had a repayment period that runs from about 1965 through 2035. And all of the costs of the State Water Project are repaid with the exception of charges that are specific to say recreation and other things like that. But essentially all of the costs for the State Water Project are paid for by its customers. And they're paid for through 2035. Post 2035, there may be some reduced costs. This has got more information since then, so not sure how significant the cost reduction is going to be, but there's the potential that there might be reduced costs. So what I'm going to be talking about in this discussion is just the cost as we know them today, and the costs after 2035 are subject to variability, and they may be a fair amount less, but they'll include just whatever costs are needed to maintain the project going forward. When, as background, there's a couple of reports that we've been working with that were done in 2016 and 2017 that looked at State Water Project costs. And for those costs, they looked at going back to 1992 and then repaying
Terry, you still there? And others here online?
He cut out for me as well.
Yeah, same.
Yes. Okay. Dropped off. Maybe I think he's rejoining. Looks like he dropped off. I tried calling his cell phone, it's going straight to voicemail, so I don't know if he's having connection issues. Okay. We can wait to see if he comes back on. We might want to move on to the next item and consider circling back if he pops back on.
Yeah, let's continue this until he reemerges. Well, we're moving into other large items.
No. I can give it another. We give it a 5-minute bathroom break and we can see if he logs back on. Myself, we can
Give him a minute anyway.
Sorry about that. Are you guys, can you hear me now? Okay,
yes.
so I don't know, where did I cut off? I was talking about the State Water Project costs and up to 2035. Did I cover most of this slide?
You're on the fifth
Okay.
bullet, Terry.
Okay, so what I was going to say was that the previous reports in 2016 and 2017, they looked at full repayment of all State Water Project costs. So things that you would expect to be included or that could be reasonable to include, like repayment of capital, but also they included maintenance costs for facilities that were ongoing and various other costs that really is not something that is, it's not it's not the estimates that they had were not, they were just an estimate of what costs might be, and it went, I think, probably overboard in trying to guesstimate how much of these costs would really be appropriate to be repaid. The repayment of those retrospective costs going back to 1992 is not a legal requirement, and it's not a common practice among state water project contractors. So what I did was just look at the state project costs and look at them in two pieces. One piece was looking at the ongoing current costs of the state water project. So that would be paying the cost as though Paso Basin was a customer, an existing customer of the state water project. And then the other way of looking at it was to add on all those past costs. And the likelihood is that there's probably some place in the middle there between those two costs that is the appropriate place. And I'd say it's much closer to the paying the current costs. But there's a policy issue there to be had, and so that's something that is the county is going to need to engage in, and that I'm going to be working with the county on and giving advice on approaches to deal with that. Next slide. So this gives you a taste of what those costs are. The left-hand side of this chart shows the charges for the State Water Project water, and this is in terms of water delivered, is close to $700 an acre feet. And this is at Colonial Pass, assuming that you're taking raw water. So there's at Colonial Pass, there's about $300 or $350 an acre foot charge for water treatment. That's not included in this. This is assuming that you have a raw water pipeline. So that's another reference point on here that I should add. And on the right, it shows what the costs are with the retrospective costs. And if you include retrospective costs for everything, that gets to be just kind of ridiculously high. And that's a number that nobody's going to be, other people outside of San Luis Obispo County wouldn't be paying for that. That's not a price that you could go out and you could sell State Water Project water for outside of the county if the county didn't want to pay for that. So that's not something that is likely to happen. So the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle, and I'm going to be coming up with some alternatives here to show for what might be a reasonable middle ground. So next slide. And this is some background on who the decision makers would be for that. So for some of those costs, for the costs for the California Aqueduct, the department is the decision maker on what any charge for additional water would be. And there wouldn't be any additional charge for retrospective costs as far as the department's concerned going through the initial Coastal Branch facility. The county's capacity in Reach 33A and 33B, that's phase 2 of the Coastal Branch. There is limited capacity there, so the Department of Water Resources would have a say in that, and that's probably where the biggest variable is. Like I said previously, the physical capacity in Reach 33A is plenty for the Paso Basin. When you get to Reach 33B, you start to get some limitations. And the last point is that DWR doesn't have any defined policy on what kind of retroactive payment is needed, or what kind of access to capacity there is. So that's all subject to negotiation. In addition to the department being a decision maker, the county is also a decision maker because it owns the State Water Project, or it's the proprietor of the State Water Project Table A amounts, and it has the say on how those are being used, and it could ask for reimbursement of past costs, and that's really a policy decision for it. And another in figuring out reimbursement of past costs, I think the type of cost is likely to make a difference. And capital costs, for instance, would be a lot more likely to be something that would be appropriate to be reimbursed. And another factor would be ability to pay. And then the last agency to remember to point out here is that Central Coast Water Authority operates the coastal branch downstream of Colonial Pass, and it is the operator for water treatment, and it gets reimbursed for costs. So it would also have a say in any use of the facilities downstream of Colonial Pass. And that's what I was gonna, that's the background on the state water project costs. Next slide. So I'll move on to the alternatives that we're looking at for this project for the Paso Basin. And so this is an outline. This is generally an outline of what we're going to be looking at in the report. And so we start off with the problem statement that the subbasin has existing overdraft, and then there's data gaps in our knowledge of the hydrogeology of the subbasin mainly. The primary alternatives we're looking at are treated water at Shandon, and the next alternative is treated water at Creston. So both of those alternatives would use the REACH 33B, which has capacity limitations. The third alternative, it would be raw water to Shandon, and this would be an alternative to the treated water in Shandon, and it could be mixed and matched with treated water at Creston. And then the last alternative would be a raw water, a short raw water distribution just to Chelam Creek. For each of these different alternatives, and these are really modular alternatives. I think what we'll have at the end is have them packaged so that you have combinations of these. So the potential uses for each of these locations would be in-channel recharge in creeks, recharge in constructed recharge basins, or direct delivery for irrigation. And those could happen at any of the Shandon or Creston site options. It wouldn't apply to the Chelam Creek option would be just in-channel recharge. And there's potential for phasing these projects. And so the concept that we talked about with EPC Water District was having a turnout above Creston, have that water be released into the Huero Creek. It would have seepage in the channel, and that could be operated with just a turnout and dechlorination facility and releasing water in the channel. And depending on the results of that, then that could be expanded on, and you could add recharge basins to that if you wanted to, or potentially deliver water directly, but you wouldn't have to commit to all those costs up front. You would just start with the minimal project. And okay, next slide. So this is the figure showing what the treated water alternative would look like for Shandon. This is for cost estimation. And so what this is looking at is the Shandon's up to the north of this figure. And there's a figure showing a proposed turnout that's a pink box kind of in the middle of things. And so that would be just a short pipeline that would release water into San Juan Creek, and it would flow down the creek and recharge the creek bed. Then there's also a proposed potential recharge basin, which is the crosshatch blue area, which is that's essentially an either or thing with the creek bed. In real time, you'd definitely go with one or the other. You wouldn't likely go with both. It'd be pretty unlikely that you would want to have recharge basin and discharge to the creek. And then the purple line shows the hypothetical or a potential distribution system. And this area works fairly well for a distribution system because there's a lot of contiguous irrigated area right next to the turnout. So that's how the alternatives we're looking at for Shandon look like for the treated water alternative. Next slide. And we're working up cost estimates for all of these features, so we're in process on that, but we don't have them all as of now. And this is the same representation for Creston. The Creston is way up at the north side of the figure, and this shows how this would work again, that you have potentially a recharge basin in this crosshatch blue area. You have a short pipeline to this blue dot, the blue dot's where the water would be discharged to the creek. That would be the lowest cost option. You just release the water into a short pipeline, release it into the creek bed, and then it would percolate into the groundwater basin. And then the purple pipeline is showing the potential for more downstream deliveries. Subsequent to us presenting this, I think we've pretty well determined that direct delivery to in the Creston area just does not seem to be economically viable. So that's not likely to be. I think we'll have an option in there for that, but the costs are not going to be something that's going to be attractive. Next slide. Okay, this is the third module of the alternatives, and this is showing a new pipeline going from Colonial Pass down to Shandon area, and this is I think it's about a 8-mile pipeline, and this would have it would go down to Shandon. It would be similar to that treated water alternative. It would have the option for discharging into the San Juan Creek, or the other alternative would be to have recharge basins. The reason for including a new pipeline, the new pipeline is a fairly expensive fairly expensive feature, but it gives you a lot of options, and the capacity constraints that we had were all downstream of Colonial Pass. So this one would essentially not have any capacity limitations. It would be and it would avoid the treated water costs for Colonial Pass. So there's a several $100 an acre foot savings there. So you would have some direct cost savings, and you would also get more access to capacity. So there's a lot of flexibility that this option would provide. Next slide.
All right, Karen, you, one moment.
Okay. I was worried I'd lost you.
No.
Well, the last option we had, well, Taylor's like, okay, here it goes. So this is a shorter version of that prior option, and this is showing about a 2.5, 3-mile pipeline. So you would take it from Colonial Pass, it would go downstream and parallel the existing coastal branch and discharge water into Chelam Creek, and Chelam Creek then would be used as a conveyance facility. Water would flow down Chelam Creek and go down into Shandon and recharge the groundwater basin. So this is the fourth option. It's a less expensive version of the prior option, but it also has some operational limitations to it. Next slide. So this is getting a little bit into cost that we were coming up with. So we are looking at the cost for these facilities in terms of 6 CFS, 12 CFS, and 24 CFS sizings. Recall that 12 CFS facility size is about what it would take to deliver about 7,000 acre feet a year, and 24 CFS would be delivering about 14,000 acre feet a year. What we were finding was that the cost differences weren't all that significant between these two different alternatives. I mean, the 3 different sizes. you have to build the kind of the same structure for each of these sizes, and most of the work, most of the cost is in just building the turnout structure. And the sizing, you can come up with 4 times the size, between 6 CFS and 24 CFS, by spending about 50% more cost. So that it's there's some cost savings there, and we'll be revising these costs as well. These costs are pretty well set, but we'll be coming up with similar costs for other features as we go forward. These do not include the cost for dechlorination, which would be required for the turnout. And the other part of the other reason why these costs are as high as they are is just that these pipelines are the Coastal Branch pipeline is fairly high pressure, and so there's some specialized construction that would be needed for it. So that's why it's in the millions of dollar range. Next slide. Okay, and then the last thing we want to talk about is some outlier alternatives that we've essentially dismissed as being too costly. One of them is having pipelines to areas of domestic well decline, and what we figured out is that for the areas that we're talking about, there's a long distance of pipeline required. You wouldn't have the State Water Project really doesn't lend itself to direct provision for direct potable use because the supply is variable. We don't have a lot of suitable recharge areas there. And then another point is that we're talking about with the domestic wells, we're talking about hundreds of acre feet of volume, and that's the volume really kind of it pushes you more towards other alternatives to take care of those needs. The State Water Project really is not, it's not the tool that you would think of to solve that problem. Second one we're looking at is we had a proposal for having a raw water pipeline going all the way from the beginning of phase 2 of Coastal Branch back to including Reach 33A. And we looked at, did a preliminary cost estimate for that pipeline, which would include 3 new pumping stations, and it was about $330 million, and that kind of dropped it from consideration right away. And then we also looked at an even shorter pipeline for releasing the water Chelan Creek, and that ends up being pretty problematic. There's an area there where the channel is not real clear, and it looked like you could potentially lose a lot of water. It just operationally, it wouldn't be very workable. Next slide. So this is getting more into the next steps that we're going, and this is actually fairly far along now. It's just that this presentation was put together a month ago. So the cost estimates we are working on is the detailed cost estimate for the water pipeline. We did have the estimates, preliminary estimates for turnouts. We're working on estimates for dechlorination basins, dechlorination facilities. That's for the treated water options. Looking at cost estimates for recharge basins, creek discharge structures, and irrigation pipelines. We're doing an assessment of in-channel recharge permit. So to release water for recharge in creek channels, there's some permitting challenges there. So we're looking at identifying what those are, comparing those to the problems that you would have with a direct recharge basin. Continuing to review the hydrogeology, and then working on the draft report, which we expect to have here in February. Next slide. And so the next steps are just that we're going to be continuing to refine the alternatives based on input we received. We're going to continue to define do the hydraulic analysis and cost analysis for the alternatives, complete the state project cost evaluation and policy meetings, and then prepare the report. So that's my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you, Terry. If you please stay with us, we're gonna take public comment on this item and then bring it back to the committee for discussion, and we may have some questions for you. That we'll start public comment with those here in the room on this item 6. Very well.
Thank you, Board. The reason you haven't delivered from the state water is because they sold 4.23 million acre feet of water and they only have storage for half of that. So they're never a safe bet. In fact, this year they're starting out at 5%. Last year started out at 10 and went to 40. So your 10 subcontractors in South County don't have a big enough buffer because their buffer needs to be more than the 50% more than what they have because they needed water last year and they're most likely need water this year. And it was only because of a couple of years ago with carryover in the San Luis Reservoir that they had water, but they've been taking water from the rest of the unsubscribed portion, which belongs to the rest of the taxpayers in the county, which has already been identified by the grand jury, that water has to be reimbursed for, including transfers and exchanges. That being said, we have, I live in Creston, I live in the watershed. They've never measured the water coming into the basin. There's a reason that the wells in Creston are 400 feet deep and the wells over by the airport in Estrella and some of the other areas are 1,000 feet deep because we don't have a problem. If you go to the 2008 water banking study, you'll see that Creston was not picked as a good place to try to bank water because our water table is high because our watershed is so good. And that's why we don't have to go as deep. And I don't think we need chlorinated water. We need stormwater capture. If we had stormwater capture in the where we get free water that we don't have to buy or dechlorinate or build any infrastructure. The infrastructure already exists. It's called the Ware River. So there's a lot of things that I don't see. We've done 6 studies now in the last 15 years on state water and what we could do with the state water and how much the state water is going to cost. The county built a turnout about 8 or 9 years ago in Shandon. They haven't used 100 acre feet there in the last 8 years. So if it's so valuable, why aren't they using it? Oh, because it costs $2,500 an acre foot and not $300 an acre foot of what you pump from the basin. But they could have offset that. They could have used that water, not pump 100 foot from the basin. And then when that water went through the homes and was recharged to the septic systems, they would have added 100 acre feet to the basin theoretically, and you would have had a 200 acre foot plus instead of minus. So they're not going to use the only water that's already available to them. Why do they expect anybody else to spend millions of dollars on pipeline and water? I'd really like to know that. It doesn't make any sense. I've been to the treatment facility at Paloma Pass, and I've seen the turnout in Shandon and been in it. It's full of cobwebs because they don't use it. That cost $1 million for the taxpayers to pay. All right. On my time?
Done.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other public comment on this item 6? Al.
Well, I'd like to thank the consultant. I know they're doing a lot of work and this is a thankless job. It appears, to say the least. So to make a long story short, I have a lot of questions, but 3 minutes I'm gonna handle that. But so what I get out of this is, one, we do not have any actual, we have several alternatives, but we have not gotten that down to actual plans, either 1 or 2 maybe of the 4, to actually go forward to do any additional analysis. And secondly, if you look at page 29 of this presentation of the 71 pages of this whole agenda, I mean, there's more costs that haven't been determined than have been determined. And the ones that have been determined all depend on various alternatives. So after all this time and effort and consulting money and costs, we don't seem to be making much progress here. It would seem like, I wonder what the deadline is for this study, because you have a deadline in January for a 5-year GSP update. And it would be interesting or helpful to us and the DWR to have a more concise explanation of exactly where we're at, not only with this project, but with all the projects, because none of these projects that the PBC is considering have gotten to a point that's even close to coming up with the rate studies and cost valuations to support such rate studies. Until all that's done, I don't think there's any place to move forward on any of these projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Other public comment on this item 6? Any online, Mr. Winston?
None online.
That I'll bring it back to the committee. Any discussion, Mr. Gibson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have quite a lot of questions about this, and one of them is really whether the feasibility, or in my eye, infeasibility of using state water hasn't more or less been determined by what we've seen today. Let me just run through a couple of things. And Terry, I wonder, in looking at the costs of this, have you got any estimate? It doesn't look like it's been included, but a key piece of the state water project is going to be the Delta Conveyance Project, should it get constructed, the tunnel under the Delta. And that's going to be really important to to access the water. Those who pay part of that cost are the ones that are going to have preferred access. Have you used any estimate of what the DCP would cost?
I have not. Oh,
So
should I go ahead and answer that?
Well, if you haven't, I mean, that's.
No, we have not included those costs for the Paso Basin, being a user that can use water intermittently. It's not as would not be as critical of a project to be involved in.
It's going to add to the cost for the table A users. So the question of whether those costs get passed by to the occasional users, I think is an open one. I think if the final report ought to at least have some reference to what that might be. Second question.
Yeah, I think we can cover that in the report, and then talk about the alternative of what would happen if you participated or didn't participate, assuming that it's something.
I think that's an important piece of it. The second question is, you didn't report on it because it's not quite final, but would I be correct in assuming that using the existing coastal branch and dechlorinating, the cost of creating the dechlorination structure should be considerably less than building a whole new raw water pipeline? Is that a fair assumption? Any particulars?
No, I think that's a $64,000 question. I don't think we're just not sure about that yet. So that's really going to be kind of the key question. I think there were some of the prior studies that were showing that the new pipeline, the new raw water pipeline, actually, if you amortize that over 20 years or whatever, it would actually be less expensive. So that's something that we have not gotten to the bottom of yet, and that's information we're going to be getting in the next month.
But one of the key costs that caught my eye was that raw water at Colonial Pass is $665 an acre foot. And if it's treated, there's another $350 an acre foot that's added on to that.
Yes.
So it's basically $1,000 an acre foot of water if it's treated.
Right.
And if you caught raw water at Polonio and brought it down, and let's just say that the chlorination is roughly the same cost as a new raw water pipeline. The raw water delivered to an appropriate point would probably be in the ballpark of $1,000 an acre feet.
Yeah, I'd have to be speculating on that. I don't know, but I think I get the logic. If I was just if I was just doing it off the top of my head, that's probably the assumption that I might make now, but I have not done that work.
And then one other question that I had is that you're doing all the cost estimate to the amount of acre feet of water delivered to a particular place in the basin, which is the obvious one. But really, in terms of basin benefit, what we're wondering is this conveyance, this project would add to the safe yield. And so I wonder, as you looked at the discharges for recharge in these various areas that are color coded as to their available, their potential benefit for recharge of the basin. Have you done any calculations of if we put an acre foot in at a particular point, how much that improves the overall yield of the basin, given that we would have variable amounts of water over, let's say, a 20-year average or something? Because I think in the end, it's the dollars per acre foot of increased sustainable yield that we really need to be looking at.
Yeah, and I definitely appreciate that as a need, and that's not something that's in our scope of work that we were tasked to do.
Those are my questions. My only observation is, I think it's also pretty speculative that 13,000 acre feet of state water would be available to the Paso Basin. Yes, that's a maximum, but just a comment is that existing subcontractors have first rights to take more state water. That conversation within at the county has yet to occur. And so it would seem to me that there's a question of feasibility just in the overall amount. I know you took 56% of 13,000 and came up with 7,100. It might be good to check the feasibility if you got 50%, 56% at half of that, whether this makes any kind of return on the sense for a return on investment. It just seems to be.
Definitely agree with your comments there, and that's something that we will be doing. So the different sizes that we're looking at for the different treated water alternatives, they were all developed with the idea that you would look at the up to 13,000 acre feet of table A available, but also you could look at up to half of that or a quarter of that. So the stepping stones would be something like 3,500, 7,000, and 13,000. So there'd be three different choices, and each of them would have their individual costs, and the basin then could.
I think that, to me, as we go down in lesser amounts, that makes a harder case for feasibility. But again, I understand that you're not done with the report. And let me just add, I appreciate that we're going through this exercise. It's one that has to be done so we can make this decision on a set of facts rather than speculation. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ham.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Terry, of all the projects that you were overviewing here, it seemed to me that probably stand out the most was probably the least cost with the most effect, and that would have been, from what I'm seeing here, is your 3-mile line from Polonia Pass to Chelan Creek using raw water. And at that point, the pipeline sounds like, from what you're saying, cost difference between a 6-inch versus 24-inch, meaning 3,600 acre feet versus 14,000 acre feet. The cost difference there is very minimal, maybe $700,000, what you're saying, put in. But would that be the best location, I guess, as far as a raw water discharge for the basin? I mean, if you were to go to that line at that point, is it gonna benefit most of the basin or the portion of the basin? Any studies done on that yet at all?
No, and we don't, that was not something that we're really prepared to, that wasn't our scope of work, and we're not prepared to look at the effects on the basin. Just looking at it from not being a groundwater, I mean, I'm a former groundwater modeler, and so that that's something you could do with a groundwater model. But just kind of looking at how the groundwater basin would probably behave, my hunch would be that, if you just put the water in the Shannon area, that would not benefit the entire basin, that you need to have water in other parts of the basin. But yeah, I don't think we could say for sure.
My other question was, many years ago, Paso Robles City looked at state water and basically went with the Occidental water pipeline, because the fact is that in the state water system, you pay for water, may not get it. Is that still the case here? In other words, the allotment that we're wanting to use, we could still pay for, but not guaranteed full allotment?
Oh, well, that was the figures that I showed you, that I showed you earlier, that year by year. I mean, there's a bunch of fixed costs with the state water project, so you pay those costs every year regardless. And then, as I showed, there's a figure earlier on in the presentation that showed how those amounts of water you actually get vary from year to year. And so you're varying from like 500 acre feet to 13,000 acre feet from year to year. So like for an urban water, for a supply for a city that wants to have water every year to deliver to a population, that really wouldn't work. But for a groundwater basin, it's a little different story. So you would expect to have that supply vary from year to year, and that's built into the costs that we've come up with.
That one chart that you showed where you kind of mentioned that it actually works good with recharge, because in good years we don't need it, in other years we do. That was an interesting chart, kind of fit with cycles of our drought versus good years. So that's, I guess, a plus in that pattern.
Yeah, it's kind of the inverse of what the water users on the coast need. They need water in dry years because they don't have any storage available, and the Paso Basin has a lot of groundwater storage available, so it can take water in the high flow years and let the other areas take the water in the low flow years. And
Thanks, Kurt. Yeah. Any other comments or questions from the committee?
I just had one question, and maybe I missed it. A couple of comments were regarding how the sites were selected, and I'm not exactly clear on how the location at Schlam Creek or in Shannon, how those spots were picked for this water. And I apologize if I missed it. It's just not fair to me. If you can kind of explain that for me, I'd appreciate it.
yeah, we didn't get into that. We when we first started out, we looked at a lot of other different alternatives for areas to distribute water to, and it's really just because of the cost that those areas that we picked are areas that where the coastal branch is adjacent to areas of the Paso Basin that you can have recharge, and you can get benefit to the groundwater basin from recharge. And in other areas, to deliver water to those other areas, you'd have to have a lot of distribution systems, and the cost just gets prohibitively expensive.
So was that information off of a different report? They kind of helped you pick those spots, or are those just logistically to the pipeline?
We did do some really super rough cost estimates of those the pipeline costs or conveyance costs, and then we also had information from prior reports showing where the good recharge areas were. And there's other areas where you could take water off the coastal branch, but in those other areas you can't deliver water to areas where you can recharge, and that was what we were looking at, just.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate all your work on this, and, you know, I think there's some recurring frustration that, you know, we're studying all these things, but I think with every study that we kind of get a report like this on, we have an option that we can consider. Now we have a much better idea of what could be done and what it would cost, that we can make informed decisions with the community about, you know, the projects we want to do and the ones we don't want. So thank you very much. Mr. Blakeslee, would you introduce item 7, please?
Yes. Okay, so item number 7 is to receive an update on a draft joint powers agreement, prepared in coordination with work on the cost of service study, which would create a joint powers authority to levy fees and perform other administrative regulatory compliance and certain groundwater sustainability plan implementation actions as delegated in the agreement if executed by the groundwater sustainability agencies, and provide direction to staff and recommendations to the individual groundwater sustainability agencies. And we have presenting this item, special counsel Elizabeth Yu.
Good afternoon, Chair, members of the board. I want to start with a little bit of a background because I haven't spoken to you on this issue before. In general, as your board's aware, the PBCC was prepared and formatted originally to serve as a coordinating body and an advisory body to the different GSAs. This formed at a time when your agencies, the GSAs, were in the process of developing a GSP. And now we're basically at a different point in time. So the focus now with the completed and approved GSP is turning to implementation of the GSP as well as funding. And so the proposed joint powers authority, or authority as we've been referring to it, would effectively take the place of this advisory board and create a new entity to serve implementation and funding functions as again go into the GSP implementation phase. A draft of the joint powers agreement has been included in the packet, and I'll be referring to it from time to time as a preliminary matter, and as noted in the gray highlighting. It is really important to note that this is only a draft. So this draft JPA was the best attempt by council representing all of the different GSAs to come up with a draft for discussion by your board and consideration by the public. It in no way should be considered to be a final draft, and certainly everyone will be looking to your board and to the individual GSAs for guidance about whether to form a new joint powers authority and what the terms of any joint powers agreement should be. That said, the recommendation is that the individual GSAs take action to approve a joint powers agreement and to form a new legal entity and joint powers authority in order to levy fees and perform other administrative, regulatory compliance and other GSP implementation measures for this basin. Next slide. So there are a few key points I'm going to walk through with respect to the draft joint powers agreement. The first is that it's quite narrow in scope. So because this would be a newly created entity, it was important as we put together a draft to make sure that the initial authorities were targeted and that they were specified so that everyone goes into this eyes wide open. Specifically, the Joint Powers Authority is not intended to modify, limit, or otherwise interfere with individual members' municipal water use authorities or rights. Similarly, no member of the authority would be making a commitment to contribute their water supply or infrastructure assets as part of the implementation of the GSP. Similarly, nothing should be construed as designating or to the authority to acquire a right to appropriate or otherwise receive surface water from Santa Margarita Lake Lake Nacimiento or the Salinas River, or to utilize related infrastructure without the approval of the affected member. And importantly, it also does not restrict the individual GSA's implementation of demand reduction measures within their respective boundaries. So each of the GSAs would retain that sort of stopgap authority to take such actions within their boundaries. Instead of formation, the different members, all of which are GSAs and have common authorities, would be designating certain initial designated powers to the authority so that the authority could take action on GSP implementation and funding measures. A lot of these are administrative tasks. So for example, the authority would be delegated the responsibility for preparing the annual updates, the 5-year GSP evaluations, et cetera. It would be performing coordinated outreach with the public as defined in the GSP. It would address data gaps and expand the monitoring network. It also would develop and implement a voluntary groundwater demand reduction program or land repurposing strategy. And on that point, I would note that there were original references to the Miller Agreement that has been taken out in favor of a voluntary groundwater demand reduction program, which would then be subject to the authority's discretion about what that looks like actually in implementation. The authority would adopt an annual budget and also a fee to fund GSP implementation efforts. It would also have the authority to establish rules and regulations or bylaws that would govern how the business day-to-day and year-to-year of the authority would be performed. And the authority also would have the ability to retain staff, including an executive director, to support its work. For now, as a placeholder, the draft JPA identifies the new authority as a Paso Robles Area Groundwater Authority. It would be a separate and distinct legal entity with boundaries over the entire groundwater basin. All of the members would retain the GSA status, and the authority only has the powers that are delegated to it by the member agencies, each of the GSAs. Again, the purpose is really to carry out GSP implementation activities and also to fund those activities. There are provisions for termination under different circumstances. The one that we highlight here is that it would automatically terminate on June 30th, 2026. If the authority has not yet established a fee to fund basin management activities. You may have noted in the draft that there also are provisions that allow the members by 4/5 vote to terminate the JPA authority. Each of the 5 members would appoint one representative similar to the composition of the PBCC. It is important to note that both the board member and also any designated alternate would have to be a member of the part of the member's legislative body. There will be certain officers that are designated, specifically a chair, vice chair, and secretary. Not noted there is that the law also requires the designation of a treasurer, so that would be built into any final draft. And a quorum of the authority would be 3 of the 5 members. For voting, a little bit different than for the PBCC, it would be 1 member, 1 vote. For most actions of the authority, the way it's structured now is that for most actions, it would only require a majority vote. There are 3 notable exceptions. That would be an adjustment to the budget in an amount exceeding $200,000 beyond an approved budget. So if you had an approved budget and a new expense came to the authority, if it was above $200,000, it would require a 4/5 vote in favor of amending the budget to include that type of expenditure. A 4/5 vote also would be required for mandatory pumping limitations. And similarly, if there is a proposal to increase individual member contributions to the budget, that also would require a 4/5 vote. For funding, and there will be a later presentation today on this, the expectation is at the moment, the majority of the fees for funding the authority's work will be through groundwater extraction fees on all groundwater users in the basins. There are certain provisions in the draft agreement for gap measures. For example, if the money is not being collected on the same schedule that expenses are being incurred, there are provisions to fill that gap until the actual money starts hitting the account. For withdrawal, the expectation is that, you know, all 5 GSAs would opt in and vote to become members of the authority. There are general withdrawal terms to account for a scenario where a member or members want to withdraw from the authority. Just to add a little detail there, a member may voluntarily withdraw upon 90 days written notice. There are also provisions in there, and I would encourage you to take a look at section 8.1, where the withdrawing member would remain responsible for expenditures that were part of the original budget that have been incurred by the authority. So in other words, if that member had already incurred a certain share of costs that had been spent, you couldn't sidestep your responsibility for paying those costs by simply withdrawing. However, the voluntary withdrawal provisions also recognize that there could be a vote for budget expenses that a member disagrees with. In that instance, if that non-concurring member who doesn't agree with the budget item wants to withdraw, there are provisions to limit the liability for the newly approved expenditures that they voted against. So a little bit in the weeds, but those are basically the 3 scenarios for withdrawal: voluntary withdrawal, you know, the responsibility for expenses with you withdrawal, and then withdrawal provisions that deal with a withdrawal following a non-consenting vote. So as mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, we thought it'd be helpful to your board to see a draft agreement in full, start to finish. There are provisions that we recognize will need further refinement and where we will be seeking additional direction. The withdrawal provisions are one of those categories. Again, it's a little bit in the weeds about how you voluntarily withdraw or a member voluntarily withdraws and what the responsibilities for even are finally been an authority. Similarly, we understand that there may be some questions or need to address some of the interim costs and who's going to be responsible for those interim costs. And we're also planning for a scenario where there may be costs beyond what can be collected by the fee. In other words, we're going through this rate setting process. There will be extraction fees. Then the expectation is that those fees will cover most all of the activities of the authority, but you want to provide for a contingency. What happens if there's a shortfall? Which member is going to be responsible and what proportion are various members going to be responsible to cover that gap spending? And again, as mentioned, while the current draft has provisions for the appointment of a chair and vice chair and secretary, we'll also need to include provisions for the appointment of a treasurer. So today, where we're looking for further direction from your board is principally on the agreement as a whole, but principally on these 4 different issues. In other words, we would appreciate the board's feedback on voting rights and voting thresholds, whether or not there's any disagreement with a framework that has 1 vote per member with majority vote for majority of the actions that would be taken by the authority. Second, whether the board is comfortable with the initial delegated powers. Again, most of those designated powers have to do with the administrative responsibilities in implementing the GSP and their SIGMA, including compliance with reporting requirements and whatnot. We'd also like to know whether or not the board feels comfortable with the provisions for the delegation of additional powers. Again, the initial designation of powers is currently framed as very limited and has to do with administrative functions, regulatory functions, setting fees and whatnot. But we anticipate that in the future, the member agencies may want to delegate additional powers. And so we would ask for feedback on section 4.6, whether the board's comfortable with that. And then finally, we're seeking input from the board about whether or not they're comfortable in termination procedures, including the ability to amend the agreement by a majority vote of the member agencies, and whether the board is comfortable with the termination procedures, including automatic termination in 2026. So I covered a lot of ground in, I think, a pretty short period of time. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to take a look at the draft agreement that was provided to you. Happy to answer any questions that you may have.
And I apologize. I think your last name is pronounced Evans.
Evans, sorry,
That was
yeah.
my mistake.
Thank you very much, Ms. Evans. I'm sure there will be lots of questions and discussion. We'll go to the first stage, public comment, and then we'll bring that back to the board and upgrade the question. Mr. Graywall.
Thank you very much, Craig Graywall. This is a repeat of AB 2453, when the people over the basin voted by almost 80%. And they voted for a representative that is not representing them anymore. So there is no voice on this board for the people that live over the basin on who they voted for and wanted their representative to be. And that should be part of any agreement. It shouldn't be handpicked because of squabbles down at the Board of Supervisors. It should be by the people that live over the basin, and that should be the end of it. And I can just see this happening. You lost an election, 218 vote and everything else in 2016, and it'll happen again because the 436,000 acres in this basin, 8% is your irrigated ag that's using 90% of the water. The de minimis users aren't part of the problem. You want all the extractors to pay? Where's the correlated rights doctrine? Why are these people using more than their fair share? It should be divvied up by acreage. So whatever the safe annual yield is should be divided by that acreage, and that's the amount you get. You don't need any of this other stuff. You get your quarter acre foot per acre and you do what you want to do without having another board, without having all this refinement, without having attorneys and everything. Let's see, I'm in my 11th year of the quiet title action, which is part of this. Ms. Evans represents the county on that action. So I know how long this stuff takes because well, we're just getting ready for our last thing. So you have 830 properties over the basin that are quieting their title. They're not going to be part of your scenario. This is really amazing because I don't remember any meeting where we voted to come up with a JPA instead of the MOA, and the MOA was never followed. There was never a budget. They never followed the rules on how members join and members don't join. They didn't follow the rules at LAFCO when they were told they couldn't be part of this committee or part of the GSA. You guys just did what you wanted. So I don't know what difference these rules make. But I can pretty much guarantee, in fact, if and all this cost of what the water is, I want to know who I give a bill to, since the water that comes out of my watershed goes into the basin. So I'd like to know which board member wants the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional public comment on this item 7. For now.
These people, there ain't nobody wants to talk.
I've been through this, it would have been helpful if it had been, the agenda documents where it was showing here, but in any event. So I've been through it. I have 28 items on here, comments and questions on this, and of course, for 3 minutes, none of that's going to be done, but first thing I object to is that this is claimed to be an update today, when in fact most of us, including the public, has never seen it. And I've been advised that certain GSA, at least one, has never seen it, even though they're claiming all the GSAs have reviewed this and been involved in, drafting it. So this is a surprise document that was laid out 6 days ago, according to its date and so on. So any of that, there's some interesting things. People need to read this. The current governance MOA allocates, for example, votes based on certain percentages. This does not. It seems to be 1 vote for each of the 5 GSAs. Other interesting items are there's provisions for other agencies to join. And I don't know how that works, because it's not really explained in here. It talks about whether a vote is a minor amendment to this or a major amendment. And there's no there's no description, for example, of how that minor versus major definition is determined by the board. They have a list of directors, and they don't even include a treasurer. You know, we have a treasurer here for the MOA. He doesn't do much work. He doesn't provide the information he's required to provide. That would be Mr. Gibson. But, you know, if you look at the MOA, there's all kinds of I'm sorry, the JPA, there's all kinds of requirements for financial information, accounting, auditing, and so on, which I actually agree with. So anyway, I cannot, you know, spend a lot of time going through this. Oh yeah, one other item on here though. There was a law firm identified as being involved in this called Stoll Reeves, LL. I assume it's a law firm. I've never heard of them. Who authorized them? Also, the Slow County Council is named as having drafted this. Slow County Council, they represent 1 GSA, not the 5. Okay, so there's a lot of problems with this that need to be looked at and resolved.
Thank you, Mr. Powell. And I will note that I'm sure there's many people who have more than 3 minutes worth of comments on this. And Mr. Blakesley, if you'll please at some point share the email address where we can receive more extensive comments to start off, and certainly I'll be reviewed and looked at. Ms. Roden.
First, I want to apologize for not coming with all the information that I want to impart with you, but we've discussed the Miller and also the voluntary groundwater. There's another option out there. It was first utilized in, it was an app utilized in Australia. It's being brought to California. There have already been discussions up at DWR with people. And it's a company called, I think it's MLJ, and I was supposed to have a meeting with them earlier this week to get some more information. So again, there was illness. We couldn't make the meeting. Basically, it's an app, and it would have to rely upon the fact that everyone in the basin has a right to a particular amount of water. That can be determined, I think, there have been, from my understanding, I haven't looked through them all, but there was an analysis of what the groundwater amounts and capacity throughout the whole basin are. So you may be in an area like Preston that has shallower wells, an area that replenishes water more easily. They may have 3 acre-feet, 4 acre-feet per acre. And then you have somewhere like, I don't know, Ground Squirrel Hollow that doesn't have, that you have to go down very deep. It doesn't have the movement of water, that they may be a half an acre foot or an acre foot. What this app does is it keeps, just basic knowledge, it keeps data from all different points, all different owners of wells. So you have to put in all your well information, depth, and that should be in the JPA, or even actually at this point, we should have all that information. I don't think we have it. From everyone that has a well, depth, age, what the draw is, drawdown, all of that. And when you want, let's say you want to
fallow one year. Or it's a drier year and you just don't want to do it for whatever reason. You can go on that app and say, somebody want to buy this water this year. It is not a permanent sale. I think we need to get away from the permanent sale area or idea, because we still have the water in that basin. And we don't want one or two owners to control all of the water. We still want all of the landowners to have a particular buy-in, if you want to put it that way. Anyway, again, I apologize, I don't have all the information on that, but I think there are other options out there than what have been presented so far. And it keeps track of everything this app does. Keeps track of inflows, it keeps track of everything. So anyway, that's just one alternative, and I'll try to pass that along to you.
Thank you very much. Tracy.
Well, my name is George Tracy, and I am the president of the Independence Ranch Community Service District. I'm not here representing them, I'm representing myself. The proposed agreement that you have here is going to give everybody the same voting rights. Right now, the county has 60% voting rights, and the city of San Miguel Water District has a significantly less district voting right. So that's a big change as far as I'm concerned. Means the county is now giving away some of their opportunity. So be it. It's the county's right to do that through their representatives. But the thing that I'm a little concerned of, and really didn't say much in the thing I read, is how you're going to pay for all this. If it's supposed to be paid for by property taxes, as was represented to us before at the last meeting, that means you're going to have a 218 vote, which requires 2/3 of the people to vote for this. And I don't know how you're going to meet that requirement, because it's a tough nut to do it. We had a 218 vote in our CSD. We had a preliminary vote just to ask people if they thought they would be in favor of it, which was 2/3. By the time they actually got the vote, it was 40% voted for it. So it's difficult, extremely difficult, get 2/3 of the people who are going to have to vote this to get them to agree to pay for something that they didn't create. Most of the de minimis users, which most of the people that buy a ranch are de minimis users. They're individual homeowners with roughly 5 to 10 acre properties. And they use very little water. Majority of them basically have a weed whacker come in and cut their weeds. They don't have anything growing. I myself have used my property to raise beef that I eat. There are other people out there that do the very same thing. I think you're going to have a real problem getting this approved from a financial standpoint. I think you better rethink that until you get to the point where it's going to be a reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Other public comment on Mr. Hoover?
And Chair, just one statement, there is the item right after this is a rate study, so there will be a lot further discussion about the concept of rates. Just want to remind the public.
Thank you, Mr. President.
That's right.
That'll be the item right after the rates, yeah, all the one.
Any other public comment on this item 7? Mr. Cunha.
Can I just stand here?
Yeah.
Willie Cunha, Shandon San Juan Vineyard, and I'm a member of the Shandon San Juan GSA, and we've been worrying about this since I've been worrying about this since the 80s. Other folks in the area for almost 100 years. A lot of it since 2015, 14, it really attracted our attention. How do we get a hold of this problem? And this JPA that Elizabeth just introduced is a real key piece of this next step that allows us to actually take action. Our current MOA was very loosey-goosey. It was very simple and allowed us to write our document where to plan to take care of sustainability. And so I think it's going to really help us move forward by approving or sending this JPA to the 5 different boards for their approval, their comments, their ideas, iron it out. It's a very, very simple document. The voting's very simple. The next presentation we're going to hear in, we'll talk about the money piece. And there'll be a lot of comments about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Sure.
Good afternoon, Jerry Ray. I'm a member of the board of EPC. I will be speaking not as a member of the board. I will be making some comments about where I think our board is. Comments I'm making this is not an official position of our board, but I think it represent certainly some comments that have been made. First of all, the majority voting in section 6.8. I think my guess is our board would vehemently disagree with that. That a 3/5 vote on a majority of the actions of the JPA would not be acceptable to us. This is again not an official position, but I think through discussions we've had, I suspect we'll have problems with that. My second comment is there's a great disparity between the voting percentages, which is basically, 1 vote per GSA, and what is on paper now we're going to be presented is there's going to be a big difference between what members of, let's say, EPC pay as opposed to, let's say, the county or certainly San Miguel. Our percentage, I believe, is strictly based on percentages. Our percentage of contributions will be in the high 30%, where others will have, much lower percentage. So I'd like to hear a comment, particularly from the members of the legal group that got together. And I will say the legal group has spent an amazing amount of time on this, gone through a lot of stuff. I know they continue to spend time on that, put together a reasonable framework. But I would like to hear comments on that. And then the last thing is I would like to have it confirmed that the intention is that the JPA will be conducting all the 218 type votes, that these will not be conducted individually by each GSA, but it's going to be conducted singularly, that's not the right word, by the JPA, and everyone voting, regardless of whether in EPC or Shannon San Juan, they will be voting on exactly the same sort of thing. So if I would appreciate some comments on those 3 levels. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment on this item 7? Yes.
My name is Mark Del Buren. I'm here on behalf of the Ag Land Trust. I have 2 questions, and I've been paying attention here. But you actually answering questions for the public, and just let people stand up and talk.
We collect questions during public comment and answer the ones that we can.
When?
In the discussion involved.
Okay. First question I've got then is pursuant to the State Groundwater Management Act, legislative intent that's articulated in the legislation that was passed indicated that nothing in that statute was supposed to diminish any property owners over like groundwater rights. So the question First question is, how is it if you have 5 members representing small areas that don't encompass the vast majority of land where the relative groundwater rights exist? How is it that you have a guarantee that those de minimis landowners or representatives are going to be able to properly protect pursuant to what the legislation called for, the overlying groundwater rights of the vast majority of the property owners in the basin? That's the first question. Second question is, does the MOA effectively preclude an obligation for 218 vote? Well, I appreciate the answer to that.
Thank you. There public comment on this item set. Any online, Mr. Bliss?
Not seeing any online.
Thank you. Well, with that, we'll close public comment and bring it back to the committee. Ms. Evans, you would maybe particularly start by addressing a couple of questions that come up to public comment. So there was a question, actually, Mr. Lacey, if you captured all those, would you run through those questions?
Yes. I think there was a comment, so going back, and you can let me know which ones you'd like to tackle. George Tracy was asking about a county giving up 60% of their voting authority and how we're going to pay for this stuff. You want me to go one at a time or just want me to read them out?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so that was one. And then Mr. Ray had asked, made some comments about the voting structure, and it had also noted that wanted some clarification about the Prop 218 done by the entity, not requiring all separate GSAs. And I might have missed, there might have been another question in there that I missed. And then the gentleman that was just up was asking about how the current structure doesn't infringe on the water rights in the way it's JP's designed, that's in Sigma, and asked about the 218 vote as well. I don't know if those all made sense.
Sorry,
So-
yeah, I mean, I kind of try to take
Yeah.
one by one if I can, and just let me know if there.
Yeah.
Side questions there. So with respect to members and with voting, it really is a policy decision and an individual GSA decision about how it's structured. So there was discussion and kind of where we landed was the 1 member, 1 vote process. It is a different structure than under the current MOA, and we're aware of that. And so it could be changed, right? That is the starting point that's recommended to basically equalize all the different GSAs who collectively through this authority are going to join forces to implement the GSP. Yes.
I wonder if I could just ask a little bit at framing first. I understand that council for all 5 of the GSAs participated in the forming of this JPA proposal.
That's right.
And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about any discussions you had about the equity of a weighted vote versus a 1 GSA 1 vote. And you did finally achieve consensus among all 5 councils that seemed to be a fair and efficient proposal. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit.
That's right. So a couple of things played into it. Obviously the county has a very large share right now. Others do not of the weighted voting.
Less than Mr. Tracy.
This is true. Sorry. And so it was simpler. It was easier, and it's also more amenable to getting things done. And there's also a question about the corresponding portion of the voting requirement, which is that you only need a majority vote to take most actions under the authority. And so it was this push-pull. Do you use more than one? If you do weighted voting, which depending on the issue would give more power to one GSA than another to get something passed, or do you have equal voting, but then just require a simple majority in order to get business done? And there's a lot of discussion, but basically it was the balancing of those two was you know, how do you allow the authority to do business and be nimble and get things done? And also feel like everyone has an equal say.
And so none of the councils in that discussion saw a particular disadvantage or disequity of one of the higher weighted GSAs being reduced to a one vote out of five.
That's right, because again, the other side of the coin is that it allowed us to get to a place where you could only require a majority.
And it's the limited authorities that are delegated here that are part of that.
That's right. It's the limited authorities. And there's also frankly, just kind of a conceptual feeling that the GSP, everyone signed on to it. You know, everyone, all the different GSAs are in this together and all accordingly should have, you know, a single vote to put toward implementation, coordinated implementation of the GSP. So, you know, it's subject to change, but the same where attorneys felt comfortable with a one member, one vote, so long as it was not requiring a four-fifths vote for any action, which on that end of things, we felt would prohibit the authority from doing its job with such a high voting threshold for the initial business.
So there was a couple specific questions from the gentleman, Magland Trust. The first was asking about, you know, how, you know, paraphrase poorly, no doubt, but you know, how can five GSAs represent everyone? And then I think it's important to note that these five GSAs cover every acre in the basin, so there's nobody that's not covered by one of these GSAs.
That's
and then the second question for something about including the 218 vote, and I didn't understand that question.
So if you look into the JPA, it basically says that the authority is going to take the lead in developing funding, and it's going to be consistent with the Sigma provisions for funding. And for those who'd like to geek out and pull out the water code, begins with water code section 10730 at SEC, a number of different sections. Within that is Prop 218 and requirements relative to groundwater management. So this authority in taking the lead on funding would have to comply with Sigma's provisions that have to do with funding and all that comes with Prop 218.
And that's related to one of the questions Mr. Ray raised, which that, you know, should this JPA be formed, it would be responsible for conducting any 218 votes necessary for the fees and intent to implement.
That's exactly right.
Fall back to the GSAs that are members of the JPA.
That's right. And for the timing of this, what we are recommending is that each of the GSAs take up the JPA agreement in January. Hopefully, very quickly in the new year, get to the point where all GSAs can support an agreement and sign on to it. And then that would allow the authority to fold into the process that's underway right now for rate setting and cost of service study.
And then we did one more point, and then you know, I think it goes without saying, but to be crystal clear, I mean, this committee here isn't forming anything or taking any action. You know, what we may or may not do is recommend that each of the five GSAs, you know, consider this proposed agreement, come back with questions or comments, and potentially create a JPA, which would effectively replace this committee. That's what it will. Mr. Hammond.
So that was my question to you, was that if, I mean, we're all individual GSAs, we're gonna go back and talk with their own individual bodies. What happens if one of our GSAs doesn't want to become part of the GSA, of the JPA? So they're on their own essentially with EWR, right?
Well, they would be responsible. So there's one GSP that covers every square inch of the basin. And so for the portion that corresponds to the boundaries of a GSA that chose not to participate, that GSA would be responsible for Sigma implementation and funding that Sigma implementation for the areas covered by that GSA. Again, our hope and recommendation is that With the recommendations of your advisory board, that the GSAs will individually take this up and see some merit in having joint powers authority take on the actual business of managing the space and subject to the limited initial delegations of authority.
Up until this time, we are a cooperative committee. Now we're for the full GPA for all of our their units.
That's right.
Any other discussion or comments, questions from committee members?
I have a couple of comments if everybody's got their questions answered. I think we've touched on the questions that came from public comment. Again, I want to make sure my colleagues on the committee here have asked their questions, but I think it's helpful. Mr. Tracy, I appreciate your commentary here. But in fact, the county does not hold 60% of the weighted contribution to this committee any longer with the existence of Estrella Health Lamar Water District on the board now. That went from 60% into the 30s, and most of the GSAs have been funding at 20 to 30% with the San Miguel CSD at a notably lower amount than that. So it's more balanced than it was, and the question of whether we get votes on board of supervisors to embrace this is a good one. I did have one other clarifying question now that I think about it, and that is you had asked for feedback on your number 3 here on the provision, the delegation of additional powers. And as I read section 4.6, it really doesn't talk about delegating. It talks about activities, shall not undertake any GSP. It says what the individual members shall not do. And the authorities shall not do basin-wide implementation activities unless we have consensus of a majority, 4/5 majority of the JPA. And members can go ahead and exercise their additional authorities for different kinds of things that are allowed under SIGMA. So I didn't see that as additional powers. I guess what I was really looking for was down in section 9.2, which I think it is, that talks about how this is amended. We can't amend the JPA if we all agree to do so. And that's where we could delegate from the individual GSAs to the authority more powers. Is that a fair reading?
Right. It's fine that you mentioned that, because I was looking at that today, thinking that we probably want to have some additional clarifying language there. So with 4.2, the idea is that the authority wants to undertake additional basin-wide measures. It could only do so with 4/5 vote. So if it decided to take action beyond what's in the initial delegation, it would be 4/5 vote. With the amendment, and this is where I think the attorney group will have to, with feedback from different GSAs, take a hard look at it. If the authority is already conducting business, you would not amend the agreement to add additional initial powers. So the initial powers are day 1 powers. So it wouldn't necessarily be an amendment of the JPA initial powers provision. So I don't know that the unanimous provisions of 9.2 would be triggered. I think it would be the 4/5 requirement under 4.2 to say that if there could be additional basin management actions, they would have to be approved under a 4/5 vote. Those would be actions that went beyond the initial delegation.
So it would be a discussion of actions versus powers.
That's exactly right.
The powers delegated are very narrow to the specifics of our job.
That's right. That's right. And if the authority wanted to take additional actions that it fell in the category of, for example, further GSP actions beyond those specified in the initial powers, that would be by 4/5 vote of the powers.
I think I understand.
Okay.
And if I could, Mr. Chairman, let me just offer some ringing comments. First of all, I want to thank everybody who commented. There were some interesting and important questions. Ms. Roden, your thoughts about that app you were mentioning sound really intriguing as an implementation. measure. And I think the JPA would be an outstanding entity to be working on that because it would naturally have a basin-wide potential effect. And so I think that's right. And to Mr. Tracy, your concern about the de minimis users is one that's been discussed a lot here at this table. And you will hear in the next item a general approach that de minimis users should be paying a de minimis amount for the management of the basin. So I think as we get to, I don't think they should be paying anything. Well, they didn't bring it from. And that's an interesting question, and we'll get to. So let me just say, in general, I think that the creation of a JPA is really important for the efficiency, achieving the mission that we need to achieve. We spent a lot of time on things like contracting for various things and monitoring various things. And the basic administration needs to actually have staff for this effort, that's singular and not attached to one of the individual GSAs. I think we have a chance to remove conflict by creating an entity. The ability to run a single 218 vote is going to be really important, I think, and also efficient. And to Mr. Ray's question, you had brought up a question of, well, different GSAs have been funding in different amounts according to our weighted percentage, and that's true. But I think the important change that comes with the JPA and the 218 is now that individual property owners are going to be doing the funding, and it's not going to be on the backs of the actual GSAs themselves. The admin fees will come individually from the property owners. GSAs are free to do what other activities are allowed after they've delegated. But I think that that's going to clarify the relationship and make it much more fair as we do it. I think the question of one GSA, one vote versus weighted voting is a reasonable one to ask. And after reading this and thinking about it a lot, I'm comfortable with the one GSA, one vote because of the limitations of the powers that are delegated. If this were a much broader JPA, that involved more than, funding that involved the 218, which eventually goes back to the constituents of this organization, I think I'd have a different feeling. But with this narrow range, I think one GSA, one vote makes sense for us to be able to exercise. So as I take it back to our board of supervisors with whatever tweaks the founding drafters might provide here, I would certainly advocate.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments or discussion from committee members?
Just from the EPC, Mr. Chair, there was at our meeting last week, there was some confusion on the majority versus the floor place voting provision. I think that is not that we have one unified stance on it, but it's something that is going to be greatly considered in our next meeting. It was nice to get some clarity on, at least on the draft where it lies today.
Well, thank you. I know a lot of work has gone into getting this draft, and there has to be a first draft. Here it is, and now it's available to everybody to be digested and commented on and revised and improved. So, yeah.
Question staff, we want to make a motion then, or at least an agreement to bring it back to all our GSAs essentially, or do you want to, what action do you want the board to do right now?
Yeah, so I think we're being asked to recommend that this be sent to each of our member GSAs for consideration and potential adoption. And I'll hear a motion to that.
Motion to do that.
Motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Abstentions? Thank you. Okay, with that, let's move on to item 8. Mr. Blakeslee, will you introduce this item?
Yes, we now will have an update from Brian Aston with SCI on the cost of service study. Brian, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Glad to be back with you here to discuss an update to the cost of service study project that we've been working on. As far as the agenda today, the first item there is confirmation of consumptive groundwater use for the fee program. So wanting to touch base here, we've had a lot of discussions about how we intend to use the data that we're going to have soon. So that's that first topic of discussion here. The second one is refinement of a 5-year budget. This is something we have discussed in the past. Of course, the budget is going to inform many aspects of what the fee program might look like. So we are looking for direction here. I have kind of a suite of options for you to take a look at, hoping to get some feedback today on which of those options seem more palatable. And then we have kind of a couple other scattered considerations I wanted to touch on at the end, and then we'll discuss next steps as well. So as I noted, the first thing I wanted to touch on was use of consumed groundwater for the fee program. So as I noted, we have a lot of data that's going to be coming into play here. We're going to have an understanding of groundwater use on parcels throughout the basin. One of the ways that plays into the fee study is that the calculation of fee rates requires projections of groundwater use 5 years in the future. Essentially, we have to divide a revenue amount by a groundwater amount. In order to develop projections going 5 years out into the future, we need a historical baseline. That is something that we can use to essentially project what's going to happen as best as we can down in the future. So in line with this committee's choice in the recent past to utilize satellite-based evapotranspiration methodology for estimating groundwater use in the basin, we are looking now at developing a rate program specifically that uses that data. So Land IQ is under contract. They're developing that data. And they are also going to be able to develop a historical baseline of consumptive use that we can again then use to project groundwater use out 5 years into the future. One last thing I want to note on this slide is that consumptive groundwater use amounts will be, of course, different than pumped extraction amounts or applied amounts. Consumptive use is always less than applied use. But I think one important thing to note here as far as fee calculation is if all parcels are having fees calculated based on that same methodology, that same data, then that process would produce a charge that's relative to all of the parcels. So we may see, it may look and feel a little different using consumptive use, but again, if we're being consistent with all parcels, it's that kind of same slice of the pie. So the next part of this is budget refinement. And as I said, we have some options here. These options were in part inspired by some feedback from the last time I was before you in September. One of these had to do with the agricultural commercial rates. There were concerns that those rates were not palatable, that they were not economically feasible. And there were concerns, I think, regarding the nature and scope of the blended irrigation water supply program and the state water project supply program. So one thing to keep in mind as I show you these different options is we've kind of played around with the budget and developed some choices that get rid of one or both of those. The other feedback we got is that domestic groundwater use, the numbers we're using for domestic groundwater use may be dated. And so we are working to refine an analysis of domestic groundwater use and domestic extractors as well. I don't have a specific update on that today, but that is currently underway. So I have for you today 5 budget scenarios. The first one that we're calling the full implementation. This is largely the budget as was presented to this committee in September. There was one slight modification, and that is we have a more accurate projection now of the cost of the blended water supply program. So WSC has been conducting their study, and we took an annual revenue need from their analysis. So there was a slight change there, but by and large, that's the same budget that we showed you in September. The second scenario is a reduced project cost budget, one of 2 of those. And that's the budget with the state water supply program removed. The third is another reduced project cost budget, and that is both the alternative water supply projects removed. So the state water project and the blended water supply project both removed. Scenario 4 is the budget with all projects and management actions removed. So just administrative and SIGMA required costs only are included in scenario 4. And then scenario 5 is kind of an alternative budget approach. It's been sort of reworked in terms of the structure of it. Of course, I'll explain that in a bit more detail in just a moment. This is something that you may be familiar with. I wanted to at least set the table by providing this information. But I mentioned that we did update the projected costs, annual costs of the blended water supply program, the infrastructure costs for that program. So essentially, we had a placeholder in that budget because we didn't have more definitive numbers at the time, but we've now included these more definitive numbers. So this number, this amount of $5,631,000 per year, is based on a 30-year loan at an interest rate of 3%, and it also includes annual operations and maintenance costs. So we do have this updated. We'll want to note as well that this does not include the cost of water itself, rather it is just the infrastructure for this program. Another thing I wanted to note here, because we have discussed different extractor categories and how costs might be allocated to those different categories. So just as a reminder, the categories we're working with here are rural domestic extractors, municipal/urban extractors, commercial extractors, and agricultural extractors. Just wanted to put that back out there again before we move forward. I apologize for how small these may be. I try to, thank you, this may help. And actually I'll have you click in a moment because I've got circles that'll pop up. I tried to make this as big as possible. Of course, we might be able to zoom in if need be, but this is the budget as presented in September with one change. And if you click one more time, Taylor, there should be a circle. So that cost there for the infrastructure for the blended water supply program has been increased to that $5.6 million per year. So that's the only change that has taken place between this and what was presented a few months back. If you look at the key on the bottom left, that explains the color coding of this. So our preliminary cost apportionment, basically applying costs to different kinds of users based on the service or benefit provided to those users. We have the base cost in that tan color. So that includes everything, the program administration budget, both signal required and administrative costs. We have supplemental non-de minimis costs. So these would be paid by municipal, agricultural, and commercial extractors. And that's the two in gold there in the middle. And then we have supplemental agricultural commercial costs, and those are in green at the bottom there. So as you can imagine, as I go through these scenarios, when we start taking out those two alternative water supply programs, those have a drastic effect on the amount of costs allocated to agricultural and commercial use. Oh, and then I just have that budget number at the bottom. So you can see that the total here, looking at a 5-year average, to give you a sense, the total comes out to just over $12 million for the full implementation.
5-year average.
That's the 5-year average, yes. Okay, scenario 2, as I mentioned, is the reduced project cost budget A. So I have 2 of these reduced project cost budgets, and this is the first one. The color coding is the same here. And as you can see, the state water project supply program has been removed. That orange italic there in the green near the bottom, that's been taken out. So you can see again from just that change, the budget goes from 12 million to about 9.5 million. But if you click again, there should be a circle that pops up. So again, that's not as big of a cost as the blended, but it still makes a sizable difference in terms of overall budget. Another thing to note as well, down at the bottom, I have costs for each of the color coding, the base cost, the supplemental non-de minimis, supplemental ag commercial. So that cost there affects just the green, right? It just affects the agricultural commercial budget down there at the bottom. Scenario 3 removes both of the alternative water supply programs. So this makes quite a large difference in terms of those average costs. So you see the zeros out on both of those projects there. Again, there were, I think, some concerns about those projects, and we wanted to illustrate what this does to the budget if those are removed. So we went from about 12.3 million to about 9.5 down to about 3.8. So a significant reduction there in budget from removing both of those projects from the table. Again, both of those are within the green, the supplemental agricultural commercial costs. So the difference there is only reflected at the bottom in the green, which comes down to about $2 million. Scenario 4 is program administration only. So as you can see, this removes all project and management action costs. This, of course, reduces the budget significantly. I think the concern here is that there may not be funding for any of these projects that may or may not be necessary. So that's, of course, a key consideration here. Another thing to consider with this is that this essentially levels the playing field, so that all of those different extractor categories would be allocated the same amount of costs, at least as it's presented in this form, because there no longer are those supplemental costs. Scenario 5, as I mentioned, is sort of a reworked, more alternative approach. So this was proposed by EPC GSA, and there's a couple of key differences here. There was some minor reshuffling of several items here. You'll notice here that at the bottom, the second half is no longer projects and management actions, but it's operations management actions and programs. One thing I want to point out as well here is under demand reduction projects, we have extractor management and basin performance. The concept with this item is that it would fund operations related to managing groundwater use data, developing demand management strategy, and related efforts. So that's one of the key differences here. The other key difference is that as opposed to specific project funding, we have included at the bottom a prudent reserve for future projects and programs. And you can see that amount varies from 750,000 up to 950,000 in year 5. Listed below that are potential projects that funding might be used for. Those were projects, some of which were listed with specific line item amounts in those previous budgets. So a slightly different way to go about it with this one. In terms of the total budget amount, it comes in relatively similar to one of those previous scenarios in terms of overall revenue need. It's a little bit lower than I think it was scenario 3, but it's a bit of a reshuffling in terms of where that money is going. Wanted to share sort of a comparison table for you from these different scenarios. So we have the total budget for each scenario, and that's a 5-year average amount again. And then we have that cost broken down from those different categories, the base costs, the supplemental non-de minimis, and the supplemental ag commercial. So as I was noting before, as you go through and remove the projects that are more expensive, you see the green line dip down more than anything else really down through scenario 4. Because scenario 4 includes no projects and management actions, again, you see no supplemental costs at all. The entire budget is in the base costs there. And then for scenario 5, again, it's a bit different. We've shuffled things around a bit. And so you have a bit of a different balance between those different categories as it stands with this preliminary cost portion. One important thing to note about this discussion as a whole in terms of budgets, this is, of course, different than the process of the PBCC or potentially a future entity establishing an annual budget. For a rate study, the budget is what justifies the rate. Again, you're dividing a revenue need by a methodological unit, in this case, like an acre feet. So what the rate study is intending to do is to establish a maximum budget amount and in turn a maximum rate that can be charged each year. And then the PBCC or its successor agency would determine the annual budget and rates each year, and they may, of course, be lower than that maximum. However, if you want to go higher than what you include in the fee study, you have to go through this process again. So we are trying to establish a reasonable ceiling, essentially, and then the PBCC or the successor agency would have the discretion to make that choice annually for what the budget and rates would look like. Lastly, I have a few other considerations I wanted to touch on. This first one, fee implementation timing and a potential funding gap. This is something I did discuss before this committee back in September. This relates to one of the challenges that may come up with the timing of fee implementation. There has been a lot of discussion, and I think the likely path, the likely recommended path with a fee would be to place fee charges on tax bills. And if that path is chosen, That information has to be submitted to the county auditor in August of each year. And then revenue is not received back by the charging entity until the following January and the following May, usually in 2 installments. So what we are looking at here potentially is a 6-month funding gap for fiscal year 2025-26 between July and January. So one of the things we have discussed is that the GSAs could contribute funding based on their apportioned costs determined by the fee study. Those funds could either be a continued contribution or they could be repaid to member agencies down the line. If they are repaid, of course, you have to start to consider kind of money flow issues and how that might look, but I think that can be resolved. Another thing not on the slide, but I think is worth mentioning is that certain costs might be able to be pushed back to the second half of next fiscal year to maybe avoid or decrease the amount of funding needed for that gap as well. So this is not something I'm looking for a solution for today, but again, just wanting to have it on the table for you. The next thing relates to de minimis for domestic extractors. And this is something we did discuss a few months back as well. Just as a reminder here, per Prop 218 requirements, the cost apportionment that we have just been discussing in some detail, basically how much of a cost is apportioned to a user must relate to the benefit or service being provided to those being charged. So the preliminary cost apportionment, the color coding in the budgets I showed you, attempts to account for the relatively minimal service or benefit provided to domestic extractors. That's where you saw that those project costs in green were not apportioned to those users. But certain costs, however, such as program administration, the domestic well impact mitigation program, likely provide some degree of service or benefit to those extractors. Our initial conversations around this was that GSA staff expressed a desire that these users not be required to pay a fee. But the end of that conversation kind of led us to a place where we were discussing the GSAs absorbing those costs or essentially covering those costs. And there are some challenges we've uncovered with that, particularly whether individual GSAs have money that can be used for that purpose. So it's not necessarily a pocketbook issue for the GSAs because this amount of revenue would likely be very minimal, but it may be an issue in terms of whether monies can be used for that purpose. For that reason, staff is now considering the possibility of charging these extractors. But I will note that depending on the final estimate of groundwater use per residence and on what budget option we go with, this charge would likely be quite minimal. This next slide is a Prop 218 fee implementation timeline. This is not necessarily exactly where we're headed, but it kind of provides you with sort of the last possible dates some of these key events to take place. So I want to direct you first to the middle on the bottom, the blue dot there. We've identified May 28th of next year of 2025 as likely close to the final opportunity to adopt a rate study in time for placement of charges on 25-26 tax bills. And that's in part due to the Prop 218 process. Notices must be mailed to affected property owners, and a period of 45 days must take place before a public hearing is held. So you have a little bit of a time constraint there where you have to sort of adopt a rate study and initiate that process. The backstop of that is the red dot, the August 10th deadline, which is the date that the levy roll would be due to the San Luis Obispo County Auditor's Office in order to place charges on the tax bills. And the last two events on that timeline are the first and second installments of direct charge revenue being distributed by the Auditor's Office, likely taking place in January and May of 2026. So pending any feedback we get today, I think our at least initial next steps is that we would utilize the 5-year budget or budgets that this committee would like to see us continue with and utilize the historical baseline of consumed groundwater use that we expect to obtain early next month to inform preliminary rate scenarios for review at the January 22nd, 2025 PBCC meeting. The other thing that we have on our minds right now is we're looking to begin development of the enabling ordinance detailing rules and regulations related to the fee program. That's all I have. Happy to answer any questions.
I want to make a couple of quick clarifying comments. We open this up for public comment. So I want to reiterate, fact that none of these budget scenarios are being adopted today. These are simply budget scenarios that would guide the rate setting discussion. And any of these projects and budget items were they to be adopted, would need to be adopted by this committee or its successor agency at some future date where they'd be implemented. The second is that, there's certainly a strong desire, I think, from most of the participants in this process that we really go to whatever lengths we can to figure out how to not charge minimus cost. So I would certainly hope that we can redouble our efforts to be creative, because that's the workers come to the table are willing to pay what needs to be paid to achieve sustainability, and that's the path forward. It's best for everyone with the base. So with that, I'll open it up for public comment, and then we'll certainly call you back up to answer some questions. Sure, after the discussion. Mr. Laura.
I'm a civil engineer by education. My older son is a civil engineer also. I can't calm myself enough to speak about this particular project and how inappropriate and how totally out of any reasonable thing it is. This is the blended water supply preliminary engineering report. There have been about 6 different versions. This happens to be the 250-page one. There have been a couple of short ones since this. And so I read this one. It bothers me because I'll be 88 the 1st of January. And so my 3 children who are all here are going to be the ones paying this, institute some part of this. And I'm sorry to say, but when you have a project that has pipelines where the engineering cost and legal and so forth is $2 million a mile, I just never seen anything in my life that's that ridiculous. And when we first conceived this about 12 or 15 years ago and worked on it, in many ways it was suggested to us by we thought, I've done 51 subdivisions in an earlier life, I've done 15 multiple projects. So it's not that we haven't done this kind of thing, but to have 36-inch pipe or 30-inch pipe and so forth costing $560, and there were just gross differences in this, even though some of my folks were referred to and talked about this. But to have something like this and then wind up with this cost when our $10 million project, I said, well, we heard the study maybe be a $50 million project. Well, it turned out it was a $170 million project, then they cut it back. But the only reason they cut it back is they just cut it back a little bit. And still, it's just totally unreasonable. And so we're talking about here, many people won't understand that this budget still doesn't include water charges and many other charges and the maintenance charges of this. So the water charges, they changed this to where they got up to better than twice the water that's available to get the cost of just the project down to $1,200 or $1,400 an acre foot. But that was using 7,000 acre feet, and there's not 7,000 acre feet of water available. But they're just one thing after another. I don't want to criticize too much, but it bothers me, quite frankly, that you're thinking of putting a budget thing up here that has $12 million or something like that on an annual cost. Because most of this is going to be paid for by the wine industry. The wine industry is in terrible shape right now. Terrible shape. If you don't pay attention, stop. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe it might be some other member of my family. I think it made my point.
Thank you, Mr. Hoover.
All right, thank you. So I'm Paul Hoover, I'm Stillwater Vineyards and Winery.
I think, I don't have 3 minutes, but, we spent a lot of money trying to figure out if there was any way we could find a supplement for our 15,000 acre feet. I think it's pretty obvious from a whole lot of stuff we've listened to today, might not be feasible. What I don't understand, and I've heard a lot today, but I've not heard anything about conservation. I would be the first one as an agricultural user to say to the domestic users, you're right, we are the problem, we are the users, and we're creating the problem. And if we weren't here, there wouldn't be as big a problem. But, we can all change our efficiencies. I irrigate a 0.7 acre feet. My neighbors might be using 1.2, 1.3. Most districts I've looked at throughout the state, there has to be a concept of usage, not an overlying acreage charge. We can be more efficient. I mean, we can. I don't think there's a great grower in the room that can't say we can do something. But boy, I've sure heard a lot of big dollars about how, we got to spend our way out of a 15,000 acre foot problem. I think we better start figuring out how we can serve our way out of a 15,000 acre foot problem. And if ET is now wonderful, we can measure it. Used to be, don't come on my land and I won't let you measure my water. We can measure it now. And if the allocation, and it should be different for alfalfa and grapes and everything, and the domestic guys should not be in the position of having to pay for this, we better start figuring out how to allocate what's in the basin. And then the only other thing I say, which I'm still confused as to who's the governing body. If the state's the big boogeyman that's coming down and going to tell us how we all better find this 15,000 acre feet, we don't have to create a whole lot of anything. We already paid for them. And I will look at you, Mr. Gibson, the county's already here. I don't know why we're creating 5 more entities to govern over this problem. I haven't heard it today. I hope I hear it tonight. I don't like the fact that, taxes are taxes, but who we're at least used to getting taxed by is either our county or our state. So I don't know why we're creating a new entity to tax me for water use. So all I say is if my water use should be 0.8 acre feet and I'm using 0.9, figure out how to tax me for the amount I'm using too much. You'd be surprised how this problem will go away very quickly.
Thank you.
Very well. Yes, thank you, Greg Grewal. Very good comment, sir. We pay for state water we get no benefit from, every landowner in this county. We started this way back in 2005 with the prior agreement, the same entities who said 25 years ago, 20 years ago, oh, we're on top of this, we can do the problem. You don't solve the problem with the same people who created the problem. I see the water code up here. The water code's only used when they want it to matter. To be a water district that doesn't have a perfect boundary, you have to have over 50% of the land over the common source of water, which would be the basin. And you also have to have a system of works in place, which 2 water districts do not have either of those. So how they were created, I have no idea. Everybody that's a domestic user that's in the rural area has a septic system. The state recognizes those septic systems as recharge facilities. The water that they're using and pumping from their ground for the beneficial use on their property is being returned. The water at other entities are not being returned. ET is not measuring the pumped water. It's measuring what's evaporating off of the plants and the soil. But it's not measuring what's being put into the ponds that aren't covered. So you can start with all the low-hanging fruit of covering the ponds, doing stormwater capture, all the things that don't cost very much to get to this point. And the most current report from GSI that was accepted was in 2018, which says we have 12 to 13,000 more acre feet than the report, the model run that Montgomery did, so that you could get grant money. Everything so far has been funded with grant money. Nobody's taken that much money out of their pockets unless they did something special. It's been funded with grant money. That is OPM, other people's money. I don't appreciate my money being spent on other people's stuff. You want well information. We've had wells being replaced since 2014. We gave all that information in the expanded thing, all the addresses. You can look at all these places that had to replace wells, over $11 million worth of wells that were replaced. They're ag clusters surrounded by vineyards. So who approved these shallow wells? The county did. Who approved the ag clusters? The county did. Who owned dry farming and cattle around them that turned into irrigated ag? Not their fault, not the other guy's fault, but you can't just say, oh gee, your well's empty. Oh, we're gonna tax you because you have a well and you're using water. They already paid taxes on that infrastructure on their property for improving their property. Now they're having to come up with 80 grand to fix what they didn't create. Thank you.
Thank you. The other public comment? Item 8. Grace.
Works for proceeding. I still have yet to find out why you're considering de minimis users at all, because they are categorically exempt from that law when it was written. So if you're considering to use money for them to pay money for this project, you're barking up the wrong tree. It will be a lawsuit like you won't believe, because there'll be people who will gather together and say, this is stupid, that they're already exempt. So I suggest you consider the fact that de minimis users are categorically exempt from this law. Thank you.
Willie Cunha once again. And so this is the other half of the needed work to start us off to be actually effective in moving ahead with sustainability. The funding, along with the JPA, we now have an agency with the power and the tools to do the considerations and take the actions. And it's likely we're not going to buy the Mississippi and bring it here. And so it's the other things that we can do, small pieces around the edge. And it's a fantastic idea that we all can reduce how much each of us use. It's not that big of a nut to crack. Likely, we're going to have to reduce extraction. And we have to take a lot of necessary steps to get there. And these are the first two critical ones. But this funding study you brought up, there's going to be a funding gap in the initial year. So even no matter which of those five, that initial board won't have the money to fully fund it unless each of the agencies willing to come up with money they don't currently have. So they'll probably start with a little bit smaller budget that first year, half year, and then as money came in, bring it up. And I bring that up now just because there's a lot of different portions of that study where money might go. And if we could effectively, efficiently, and cost effectively take water from the Nassau and the city of Paso and deliver it to where we know we have an existing problem with wells going dry, that would get us out of trouble with sustainability, that would be a worthwhile investment. As it's currently written, Jerry Lord brought it up. It's way out of whack, and they're not delivering the water to an exact specific place where that fire needs to be put out. That doesn't mean a future board can't have the engineering and cost effectiveness to do that. So you don't want to take away for short term the 5-year ability to start looking at that. And that brings me back to my point of you're going to start with a smaller budget, this future JPA board. So we can have a funding study that has these ideas in it with potential money set aside that a future board will never ever use unless 4/5 of the board see a clear path to deliver that water to a place that would actually be effective and useful to create sustainability at a cost they could afford. I'd recommend you guys move this to the GSA boards for their consideration. looking into this meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Their public comment, Mr. Powell.
Well, quick response to Mr. Zimmerman's comment about Nancy Water. I may be wrong on this, but my understanding is that Nancy Water has provided a number of contractors who have paid for the entire pipeline, and anybody else who wants Nancy Water does not have the right to it without all the contractors agreeing to providing such water. So that whole Nancy Water pipeline thing to me was a red herring. Thrown out by Mr. Kuhn. Secondly, unfortunately, I used to be a CPA, which I think you've all heard. I bore everybody with numbers, but I find these 5 scenarios interesting in that so there's items that are absolutely understated. For example, executive director and support staff. I know that when Mr. Greeley was hired back in 2021 or whenever that was, and it's all public record. He started out with at least $262,000 of wages and benefits, and in here, this doesn't even show any increase. And I assume there's been increases, I would hope, for him since then for these next 5 years. I also am just amazed that there's actually a proposal here in this scenario 4 and 5 that eliminates all the projects that you had spent the last 5 and 6 years telling everybody in the DWR are the projects that are going to help resolve our problems. Why are we wasting consulting time and money on putting out stuff like this that isn't going to happen this way? I mean, it makes no sense to me. So it would be nice if these consultants get more redirected into being providing some useful information, and to keep having these meetings with this kind of no answer or ridiculous analysis going on is wasting all of our times. So let's get these studies done, and then let's look at what we actually have. But you guys need to start directing these guys in the right direction. I even heard the other day in the EPC Shannon San Juan joint meeting that you could barely hear on the phone because the audio is so bad, that even those 2 districts are very concerned, because there were comments that the JPA shouldn't even be considered till all these rate studies get done. So once again, we got the cart in front of the horse and wasting time and money on trying to get things done that aren't getting done.
Thank you. Any other public comment on this item 8? Any online, Mr. Wicks? None online. Okay, with that, I'll close public comment and bring it back to the committee for discussion and questions of Mr. House. Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah, a couple of questions. When you were here, I asked our legal team, I understand putting people on the spot. Can you talk a little bit about de minimis users being exempt from CEQA versus the challenges you've encountered in making the case that they have no benefit in the administration? And that's a slippery concept. I understand how it be misunderstood.
Absolutely. So, one of the challenges, and Stoll referenced earlier, the sections of the water code that deal with Sigma funding, starting with 10730. One of the challenges is finding how those water code sections coalesce with the California Constitution, which includes Prop 18, Prop 26. While those users are explicitly exempt from certain regulation under Sigma, there's no reference to those users in Proposition 218 or Prop 26. So in finding out the appropriate framework by which to go about a rate study process under Prop 218, we really just have to look at the service provided to the end user and the end or the ratepayer. So we again are looking at ways to cover those costs in a different manner. What we can't do is have the other ratepayers fund those costs. You can't collect money as a part of a fee program and then use some of that revenue to exempt certain people from the fee.
That's within the Prop 218 proposal that would be put forth. You can't charge a member of EPC to pay to let a de minimis user end up with a zero.
Exactly. You can't have other ratepayers like subsidize a specific user class within the program.
Does that hinge on the fact that while they're de minimis, these potential users do extract groundwater?
Yeah, and it really comes back to an analysis of these costs we've been discussing. And between discussions with staff and legal counsel, we found there were certain costs where it's I think perhaps difficult to argue that no service or benefit is provided, particularly something like the domestic well mitigation program. The other thing I'll note is that, Proposition 218 is intended not to be punitive. It's an analysis of a service provided, not an analysis of how we got here essentially, which is challenging to apply that to a real life situation when there are, that reality does exist. The history here does exist. But we are trying to adhere as closely to the requirements of Prop 218 as well.
And the desire is still to drive, if there has to be a cost put forward in a 218 that a de minimis, that would be as small number as possible.
Yes, and one of the ways that would just happen naturally as a part of that process is we will develop a cost per acre foot. And a water use amount will be allocated to that type of user. Let's say it's a half of an acre foot. And then if we're moving forward with consumptive use, that will be then translated to consumptive use in a different manner than agricultural users, of course, because we can't use evapotranspiration measurements. But it would be just a fraction of that acre foot charge that would be applied to that.
And of course, the numbers are what everybody's going to care about.
Sure.
What's the timetable for coming up with it, at least a preliminary set of options?
Absolutely. So our hope is to come back to the January PBCC meeting with preliminary rates. We have a historical baseline of consumptive use being developed by Land IQ that will allow us to have something plug into our rate equations. And then depending on which budget or budgets this committee would like to see us come back and present rates based on, we hope to do that in January.
So going to that, if we look at your scenario number 5, which in my estimation makes the most sense. I think Mr. Lohr points out in Mr. Lohr's comments, I resonate with the fact that these projects aren't ready to start charging people. Well, there's a lot of work to be done before we get to them. So that makes sense, not going after the blended or the state water project. But Mr. Hoover brought up a really good point about conservation. And does alternative scenario 5, does that provide an opportunity for the JPA, if it's the entity or the collection of GSAs, to work on conservation measures, to promote conservation measures, to do something about conservation?
I would say I think that the extractor management basin performance line item is intended to support that effort. I would also say that I think funding from the prudent reserve could be used in that way. The one thing I'll note is I do think that this is a somewhat unusual way of using a prudent reserve, but not that that's prohibitive. But it's not something I've seen exactly done in this way.
Well, and so maybe the amount in the prudent reserve versus the amount in the extraction management could be adjusted to provide for the possibility of conservation being a project that the GSAs or the JPA will.
Sure.
That would be my thought, my suggestion.
Absolutely. And that's feedback we're happy to hear. Can you scroll back, Taylor, for me to scenario? I think it's 3. So another, so I think scenario five speaks to what you were pointing out. Just wanting to point out this option as well, that this removes those two alternative water supply projects. This does have a slightly higher budget amount, partly because it has funding for the Miller program, for a demand management program, for a water conservation and irrigation efficiency program. So this budget is maybe a little more specific with how it's allocating the funding. But it shares with scenario five, the fact that they're both sort of maybe a middle ground of some sorts.
And does scenario 5 allow for the Miller program to be?
You list that as one of the potential uses of funding for that prudent reserve. Miller is listed down there, water conservation. So see, that's what I want to point out is those are all listed as potential funding sources here. In scenario 3, they're a bit more specific.
And have GSA staff commented on the amounts that are proposed in these scenarios as to their feasibility for actually, I think Miller is something we've got to pursue. It's a voluntary program. It's something that makes a lot of sense. Have GSA staff and the representative technical experts suggested that you have enough money there to do that?
All of these numbers were developed in consultation with GSA staff. We sort of workshopped these different budget options over the last 4 months or so.
Yes. Then can you speak to the degree, so whichever scenario you use in your final rate study and kind of build a rate structure around, how much flexibility does the future committee or future JPA have to adjust the actual use of funds if that's budget that was used for the rate study?
Well, as I spoke to earlier, you can always come down from the max budget and you can't exceed it without going through another rate setting process. You can always come down. As far as flexibility, because we're dealing with this different cost apportionment, the color coding, I think you would just have to stay in line with that rationale. For example, if something is a demand reduction project, you couldn't move it up to administrative. I think you would have to stay in line with that part of the methodology that analyzes the budget. Within that, I think you would have great flexibility within that frame.
I think there's a desire from a lot of participants in the process to make sure that we set rates that raise a sufficient amount of money to accomplish real projects, real things. And I think there's also consensus that some of these larger projects are, far from being shovel ready. They're far from being deemed feasible. But that we can always, this rate study's in place for 5 years. We can always authorize higher rates than we intend to charge so that in a future JPA isn't hamstrung by the decisions that we made today.
And to that point, so if we, whatever one of these budgets we go with, that again will establish the maximum budget and maximum rates. And then next year, this body will, or a future version of this body will come together and decide what the budget will be for the 25-26 fiscal year. At that point, you don't have to choose the numbers that are in this table, right? That's a separate process that will inform what the rates are, but you have that option. You have that leeway to do so.
Any other comments or questions from committee members?
Yeah, I was just gonna make a comment that again, I know that study Lord's way of farming, they're very efficient, and Paul's comment about being more efficient. It's gonna be a different kind of scenario when somebody's already super efficient versus somebody's tonnage. Is gonna be a lasting, in your industry, quite a lot of difference there. So that's another thought. We could maybe produce some sort of way of limiting the amount of growth and the amount of fruit that I guess could be used, basically related back to water. So that's, you don't use this much water to produce that much fruit. Something like that in the whole plan here might be helpful too. That would also drive more efficient use of water. Clearly. And I don't just thought that I've seen that here in it's wrong, but there's others that a little more tonnage versus more quality. That's something we heard out there as well as another option.
comment from the IPC. There's a general consensus that like full implementation budget is probably not all that palatable at the moment. It's just too expensive. And in our last meeting, there was some interest in getting some baseline figure cost to be able to decide on the potential scenario. So if we're asked to have recommendations on scenarios without that information, like that is a kind of a, it would be very helpful to inform our decision if we had some idea of what that might look like. Turns on a recurring basis.
Absolutely, and I realize it's a bit awkward to be looking at a budget without seeing the way that it informs the rates. The reason we don't have those is because we don't have that historical baseline of consumptive use and IQs new to the baseline. They are developing that, and we realize that's going to be a necessity for this body to make a decision, and we hope to provide that in June.
So what you're looking for today is direction on which scenario or scenarios combine that historical consumptive use data in early January to come back at our meeting in late January.
Yep.
And is there a number of scenarios that you think is worthwhile to model in your?
I could come back with all 5. That might be a bit tedious, and I don't want to do that if this body feels that one or more of these is not viable. But I'm happy to come back and model rates based on as many of these as there is interest in.
Mr. Chairman, I think somewhere between scenario 3 and scenario 5, as well. So we've got a range, it's a fairly narrow range, but maybe a little bit of nuance can be articulated there. We can get a sense of what particularly is different, flexibility versus specificity, those kinds of things. And let's run it. It seems to handle what we're ready to do. Projects, I sense consensus that projects aren't ready to be put in the budget. So 3 and 5 really by default. We need to do just the bigger work. Yeah, right. So that's where I'm going.
Yeah. So, I think that there's certainly not consensus to move forward with any of these, massive supply projects. We're in the early stages of determining if they're even remotely feasible. There's a lot of hurdles to overcome. They may never see the light of day. However, I think that there's certainly from my GSA, there's a desire to establish the rationale for rates that are higher than either scenario 3 or 5 are going to lead to, because we think that there will be more uses for those dollars that are beneficial in the short term, whether that's incentivizing more fallowing and repurposing in the Miller program or incentivizing other conservation. So I think it would be at least worthwhile to run the numbers on either scenario 1 or 2 and see what level of rates that will result in, even if the end use of those fees isn't for the projects that are specifically enumerated in those scenarios.
Could I make the suggestion, Mr. Chair? So you're looking at scenario 5 and I'll go with the 5-year averages of 3.2. And scenario 3, not that much more, at about 3.9. Could we, if we're not ready to do projects, could we suggest a scenario 3A, which might bulk up some of those to make that something more like a $5 million a year, just to see it, where monies would be added on certain lines, be the higher. Scenario 5 is the lower end that has some projects in it. We could revise scenario 3 slightly to be a higher end modified version. You see where I'm going with that?
Yeah.
And see what the numbers come out. Yeah. Make consumption. Well, let's go.
This is something about the fact that once you got these models built, it's what ifs, you know, what if this, what if that? I think it's kind of cool. You've got the story down. And there's a whole lot of movers. Get a certain value of people things. Crossing the case, so to speak. Make it, well, so that might be also things. Hurts memory. Said 3D or.
Sure, and I'm happy to do three. Yeah, and I think, I mean, that does give you a bit of a range there, right? The full, the small, and the middle. And once I get those consumptive use numbers, like you said, I just plug it into the sheets in the same way, and I can get those preliminary rates. I will note, legal counsel just shared with me that we may want to reserve our right to take a closer look at scenario 5 from a legal perspective. This was something of a late addition, and I don't know if everybody's had a chance to review, so that may be a consideration as well.
Is that sufficient direction?
Yeah, so I think we're looking at 1, 3, and 5 as options to come back and model. One, or one. Can I misunderstand? I'm sorry.
You said, oh, I think Bruce was talking about a variance between 1 and 2 or option 3A. Instead of. I think, you know, he's trying to say in that value of 5 million range versus 3. To see what.
I think 1 or 2, because they involve big dollar projects. They're not ready to talk about, so. Those would be out, but something a little bit more than scenario 3 would be. Helpful to look at, you know, more conservation or whatever we do there. I think that's the range that we're in.
Perhaps 5, 3, and 3 with a little juice added to conservation and Miller, something to that effect.
To give us a range of kind of rate scenarios.
Absolutely.
I think that's a reasonable approach. See what the numbers look like.
Okay, absolutely.
Any objections from any members to that, Diana? Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So on to item 9, Mr. Blakesley, will you introduce this item?
Yes, this is works kind of as a companion item to some of the discussions you just heard. And I'll turn this over to Mr. Reed.
Thank you.
Good evening. Blaine Ridley, County of San Luis Obispo. Just this agenda item is to provide direction to staff on the development of fiscal year 25-26 PBCC budget. So obviously, there's a lot of conversation tonight about potentially transitioning from the PBCC to the JPA 2025. But that notwithstanding, we still need to think about per requirements of the MOA, developing a budget, an FY 25-26 budget for the PBCC. And if you'll recall last year when we did that, the way that works is that staff gets together, develops a recommended budget at, with guidance from the members. We take that to PBCC. Once this board is comfortable with it, then that gets recommended for moving on to each individual GSA for consideration. Last year there needed to be time to go back and forth between the GSAs a little bit to get final approval of a budget by all 5 GSAs. So we need to start that process. And I don't think anything will be lost if we do in fact transition from the PBCC to the JPA. I think the budget will probably be, will be transferable. So this is where we need to start. This is really kind of the timeline. I don't think I need to get into the details there. But we're looking basically for your direction to begin the process at the staff level to be able to bring a draft budget back to your body for consideration. And Taylor, when do we think we'll shoot for the initial draft?
I think we'd be looking at March. That was something in March as a preliminary. Okay.
in developing that, budget for your initial budget for your consideration, we're going to take into account the information that you just provided, Ryan, the SCI. So we'll be working with Ryan to consider those rate scenarios. And then the other thing to consider is that gap funding issue. Right? Do we want to backload next fiscal year's budget so that we can keep spending light during the first portion of the year when we don't really have access to revenues coming in right under the MOA, if that's still in place, that those expenses would be a portion for the MOA cost percentages. So really just looking for your direction to get started on this process.
When do you want to bring the budget back?
We're saying,
When?
March, end of March.
Let me take public comment on this item and discuss. Any public comment on this item 9?
I think we have tremendous opportunities in the budget here. One of the things we've not talked about, and one of you spoke about this a little bit, we're already pulling some of our vineyards. And any industry that is producing more than the market needs cuts back on its production. It's very simple. And so, and we also have some technology that's coming where we know that some of our neighbors, and I'm sorry to say it, I don't know if there are any of them here, I don't see any of them here, maybe watering more than they need, has been pointed out. We're going to learn that. And so we don't need to water 3 acre feet. We can't necessarily get by in dry years without 0.75. But let's just look at the simple numbers. Numbers here are 35,000 acres of vineyards, which may soon become 31 or 32,000. And we're looking at 60-some thousand acres of water use. Okay, that's 2 acres. There's a figure in a lot of data, it's 2.1. So let's really look at some of these. If we put it the Miller program, that's up to Blaine or somebody else. There are things we can do to cut back water use. So we don't have to get these projects, or the industry is going to force us to cut back things. So I'm not as concerned as I was seeing that thing go like that. So I think we can do it. I'm glad to be for these staff any way we can help.
Thank you. Any other public comment on this item? Mr. Powell.
I'll get them. I don't, have Mr. Ridley has a real job here, because based on the last agenda item discussion, I don't know, where we're at on budgeting anything at the moment. I don't know if March is actually a deadline for getting the budget done, but it seems like a lot of work needs to get done, needing to figure out what we're going to be doing, not only for beginning July 2025, what we're going to be doing between now and the end of June 2025. And we have a budget now that's been played around with and rejected and approved and then unauthorized change and so on right now, in my opinion. So that's one comment. And then the other thing is, once again, going back to these 5 scenarios, I would hope that none of these are actually going to be the basis for the next fiscal year's budget. So that's where I'm at, and it'll be interesting to see what we come up with in the next 3 months or so.
Thank you. Any other public comment on item 9? Any online, Mr. Blakeslee? No. Okay. First public comment, bring back to the committee. I think we obviously want to move forward and develop fiscal year 2025-26 budget. Do you need more specific guidance, Mr. Reilly, or you
What about carryover also?
Take it out.
No, I think with the direction that you gave the rate consultant, I think we know, generally, we probably will bring, maybe 3 versions of a budget for your consideration that will, tie in with, Ryan's work.
And I think, so the options to address the funding gap, again, don't need an answer today, but those are issues that we'll need to get clarity on likely at the next meeting or so.
Right, well, as we develop proposed budgets for your consideration, how are we gonna, how does this body want to address the gap issue, the gap funding issue? Is that gonna be self-funded and proportional among the GSAs, moving them away? Or is that something, as I think Ryan mentioned, are those funds going to be potentially, short-term financed and paid back through rates later? There's some options there that we can present to you for your consideration later.
I think that swing options is probably the scenario to determine, because you're gonna be concentrating on the administrative side of the budget. Plus, consultation with our consultant on the non-administrative side, and then that cash flow problem, could be a line item, we need to spend X in interest to bridge 6 months or something. That's another. And can we backload for activity?
And I think it's gonna make sense to backload, because effectively you're gonna be starting up a new entity, right? It's gonna take a while to build all those pieces, get all those pieces in place, so.
Maybe if maybe the contingencies, which you're gonna build contingency into the budget. Maybe in their lives, they build the cash flow.
Okay, any other comments, questions?
They got new direction.
Good, thank you. Okay, well, the town hall, this evening, is an agenda as part of this meeting, but it's not scheduled to begin until 5:30, and it's 4:10. So that will recess until 5:30. Thank you very much.
And for those online, the town hall will
Folks that are gonna rearrange the chairs, are small, and the lovely young ladies. Any volunteers for helping to move chairs would be greatly appreciated.
And for those online, the town hall will not be broadcast via Zoom. It'll be a breakout discussion, so this will conclude the Zoom portion of this public hearing. Thank you.